The Subcommittee on Highways and Transit will come to order. I ask unanimous consent that the chairman be authorized to declare a recess at any time during today's hearing without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that members not on the subcommittee be permitted to sit with the subcommittee today to be able to ask questions without objection, so ordered. As a reminder, if members wish to insert a document into the record, please also email that document to documentsti@mail.house.gov. I now recognize myself for the purposes of an opening statement. Good morning and thank you to our witnesses. We appreciate you being here for today's hearing. The subcommittee is continuing our efforts to address the supply chain crisis that was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and the administration's extreme Green New Deal agenda. Today, we're specifically focusing on the challenges faced by our nation's trucking industry. The trucking industry plays a crucial role in the supply chain, ensuring that goods and supplies are transported from one location to another. A popular refrain that demonstrates the importance of the trucking industry is, if you bought it, a trucker brought it, because nearly everything purchased for your home got to the store on the back of a truck. Simply put, our economy requires a properly functioning trucking industry. More than 70% of our nation's freight tonnage is moved by the trucking industry every year, and more than 80% of our communities get their goods exclusively by truck. Over 8.7 million commercial motor vehicle driver operators in the United States, traveling billions of miles every year, serving every community in our country. At today's hearing, we'll hear more about these challenges and explore solutions to make it easier for commercial trucking companies and truck drivers to do their jobs, which in turn will help ensure we don't see more of the Soviet-style empty store shelves we witnessed during the pandemic. Every company and each driver must comply with a myriad of rules and regulations at the federal, state, and local levels to make sure their loads are safely delivered on time. We need to make it easier for women and men to choose this profession, which is one of the most common paths to middle-income lifestyle that does not require a college degree. This means attracting more potential drivers earlier in their work careers and making it easier to train and test for a commercial driver's license, or a CDL. The Drive Safe Act, introduced during the prior Congress, is one idea. The bipartisan proposal would allow 18 to 20-year-old drivers to cross state lines, which makes sense to me since 49 states and the District of Columbia already allow 18 to 20-year-old commercial motor vehicle drivers to drive within their state's borders. A 3-year pilot program testing this concept is in the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, or IJA as we call it, but the administration appears to be trying to kill that pilot by including requirements not in the law. I encourage the administration to change direction. We must also improve the quality of life for truckers on the road so that they'll choose to stay in this profession. Increasing the amount of available truck parking will help improve the quality of life for truck drivers while preserving safety and productivity. While truck parking was not included in IJA, the committee last Congress considered and passed Congressman Mike Vos' Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act, which would create dedicated funding for truck parking. I'm a co-sponsor of the bipartisan bill that he reintroduced earlier this year, and I look forward to hearing witness feedback on this legislation. Currently, the industry is short 78,000 drivers. Over the next decade, it's estimated that roughly 1.2 million new truckers will be needed to replace an aging workforce and keep pace with demand. It's important that we explore ways to make this professional career more attractive to employees and encourage more individuals to join the industry. At a time of sky-high fuel prices, and while many Americans were able to work remotely, our truckers delivered in person. And unfortunately, when it costs more to move product from point A to point B, consumers feel the impact. Inflated fuel prices also significantly cut into owner-operators' take-home pay. Despite these headwinds, the administration continues to prioritize their progressive ideology. They tried to stop states from using their highway money to expand capacity, which thankfully we were successful in getting them to reverse. Now they want to essentially outlaw diesel trucks. Also troubling, the Biden administration is continuing to put its thumb on the scale for one type of engine, electric, that the marketplace simply is not ready for. Electric trucks are not widely available for purchase, are more expensive, and also weigh more. Either truck weight limits will need to increase, or we'll have to increase the number of trucks on the road. And while this is not the purpose of today's hearing, I remain concerned that electric vehicles do not contribute to our user pays highway trust fund system. There are also concerns regarding where the critical minerals needed to make batteries come from. If a business wants to invest in alternative fuel vehicles, that's one thing, but I believe that businesses should have the opportunity to make their own decisions without the government forcing them into a corner via their hasty and unrealistic pursuit of electric trucks. I look forward to hearing your ideas about how best to help trucking industry continue to deliver for all of us. I now recognize Ranking Member Holmes Norton for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would like to thank Subcommittee Chair Rick Crawford for holding this hearing on the trucking supply side. It is hard to fathom where our country would be without the trucking workforce. Trucks move 73% of all domestic freight by value, totaling 12.6 billion tons of freight in 2020. This essential workforce delivers for America and supplies everything from groceries to clothing to life-saving medicine. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted global supply chains and highlighted long-standing challenges facing the trucking industry: inadequate parking space, bottlenecks at ports, long hours on the roadway from home through all of it. Trucks kept delivering for America. Our committee has already passed several pieces of legislation to address the supply chain challenges caused by the pandemic: the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which include funding and policy changes that reduce freight congestion and bottlenecks, were enacted into law. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act made major investments in our freight network, including $7.25 billion in infra grants and $7.15 billion for the National Highway Freight Program. These numbers demonstrate the commitment of President Biden and everyone who voted for the infrastructure law to improving freight transportation. Our focus at our hearing today is to hear from stakeholders on the challenges facing truckers and the industry as a whole. I know the truckers form the foundation of our supply chain. To that end, a secure and reliable supply chain must be a safe one, supporting our workers through family wage jobs, better working conditions, predictable and safe parking places, and life-saving safety equipment ensures our freight moves. I have long supported strong entry-level driver training standards so that we ensure truckers are fully prepared to safely operate their vehicles and deliver their freight. Providing robust training empowers drivers to be safe and confident on the road and is an important way to attract quality drivers. Driver compensation is also at the heart of our discussions here today. Better wages will help the industry attract and retain its workforce. Simply put, better wages will ensure we have the capacity and the capability to safely deliver goods on time. Better wages lead to more secure supply chain. Finally, safety is our highest priority: safety for truck drivers and safety for everyone who shares the road with them. Far too many are lost each year in traffic crashes. For truck drivers, the roadway is their workplace, and we owe it to them and all road users to improve our highway safety. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today and hearing their proposals to improve safety, support workers, and improve the reliability of our trucking supply chain. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady, and now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Larson, to make an opening statement.
Thank you, Chair Crawford and Ranking Member Norton, for holding this hearing to continue this committee's work to strengthen our supply chain. So last Congress, this committee succeeded in passing laws to move our freight network in the right direction and improve our nation's infrastructure. Thanks to the bipartisan infrastructure law, we're making historic levels of investment in the supply chain. The $350 billion in Federal Highway Administration investment flowing to states, counties, and cities under the BIL is improving roads, bridges, freight corridors, and intermodal facilities. This funding is working to tackle our largest infrastructure challenges and freight bottlenecks, and Congress has structured these investments so that every state benefits from these dollars and every state has control over how to invest in them. Ensuring a well-functioning supply chain means better infrastructure everywhere and an elimination of bottlenecks wherever they exist. And everyone who voted for the BIL voted to make our supply chain more efficient and more resilient. The administration's work to address supply chain challenges stemming from the pandemic also supports this goal. The Freight Logistics Optimization Works, or FLOW effort, is a public-private partnership to create information sharing between elements of the supply chain, and it has reduced delays that stem from the lack of coordination. We also passed the CHIPS and Science Act and the Inflation Reduction Act, bills to spur more U.S. manufacturing, leaving us less dependent on other countries and launching new industries at home. And we're already seeing the benefits of these decisions with the more than $435 billion in major private sector investments in U.S. manufacturing since the start of this administration. The challenges in the trucking supply chain that erupted during the pandemic came as a little surprise to this committee. Chair Norton, at the time, held a hearing in the subcommittee in 2019, before the rest of the nation was paying attention, to highlight the pressure trucking companies and drivers are under to deliver goods efficiently with roadway congestion, outdated infrastructure, soaring freight demand, and workforce challenges. That laid the groundwork for many proposals in the INVEST Act, $1 billion dedicated for truck parking, strong entry-level driver training investments, protecting U.S. drivers from unfair competition, and ensuring fair driver pay. And while we're no longer seeing the empty shelves and shipping delays we faced early in the pandemic, we are far from solving some of the underlying problems in trucking that affect our supply chain. So that leads us to the question, what are today's challenges? 2 words, safety and workforce. The backbone of our supply chain is people. The truck drivers, railroad workers, longshore workers, and warehouse workers who support moving goods from point A to point B. Truck drivers, including Teamsters and the OOIDA members who are represented here today, risk their own personal health and safety to get goods to market and deliver life-saving medical supplies during COVID, while they themselves had little support available with rest areas and services closed. We owe them a debt of gratitude for their work every day as they continue to operate in difficult situations. Too often, supply chain discussions solely focus on productivity, how much, how quickly, how cheaply things can move. But this lens skips over an integral part of the supply chain, and that is people. Protecting the safety of truck drivers and the traveling public must be the top priority. But safety indicators show that driving a truck continues to be a dangerous job. According to the National Safety Council, 5,788 people died in large truck crashes in 2021, an increase of 47% over the last 10 years. We also need to make sure workers are paid fairly. In many cases, truck drivers directly absorb the uncertainty of goods movement, everything from congestion and wait times at ports and shipper facilities to fluctuating fuel prices in a way that you don't see in other industries. Greater productivity does not mean greater pay in many segments of the industry. If truck drivers aren't safe, if they aren't well paid, if they aren't well rested, if they aren't well trained, we're going to see consequences. We're going to see fatalities, worker retention issues, and an inability for supply chains to sustain economic growth. So I intend to focus the committee's attention on how Congress can best support workers to ensure they have a safe workplace and the tools to succeed in their jobs. And I understand from Chair Graves and the full committee that the committee will soon consider a supply chain legislative package. So I look forward to hearing ideas from our witnesses today. Am I out of time already, Mr. Chair? No, sorry. I've witnessed today to inform that effort. Hey, workers got to work, people. So with that, I yield back.
Were you banging that, or who? Somebody's doing some work over there. There's actually being work done in Washington, so that's good. I thank the gentleman. We'll be hearing from, I'd like to welcome our witnesses and thank them for being here today. We'll be hearing from Mr. Louis Pugh, Executive Vice President, Owner-Operators Independent Drivers Association, or OIDA. Mrs. Ann Ranke, President and CEO of the Transportation Intermediaries Association. Mr. David Fialkov, Executive Vice President of Government Affairs at both NATSA, representing America's travel plazas and truck stops, and Sigma, America's leading fuel marketers, and Mr. Cole Scandalia, Senior Legislative Representative and Policy Advisor for the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. Briefly, I'd like to take a quick moment to explain how our lighting system works, and this will be familiar to you being that you're in the trucking industry. There are 3 lights in front of you. Green means go. But unlike a stoplight, yellow does not mean proceed with caution as you might expect. It means kick it into high gear because it's fixing to turn red. And that means we'll need you to conclude your remarks. So when it does turn red, you'll probably hear a little tap, 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 just to remind you that your time's expired. So I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that, and I ask unanimous consent that the witness's full statements be included in the record without objection. So ordered. As your written testimony has been made part of the record, the subcommittee asks that you limit your oral remarks to 5 minutes. With that, before we hear from the first witness, Mr. Pugh from Missouri, I would like to recognize Representative Burleson of Missouri to say a few words of introduction about our first witness.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford. I have the honor of introducing one of our witnesses today, Louis Pugh, who is a resident of the great state of Missouri. Mr. Pugh is a small business owner. He has 26 years of experience in the trucking industry and has tallied over 2.5 million miles behind a safe truck with no records of accidents or anything. Mr. Pugh also served this nation in the United States Army for 6 years. And Mr. Pugh has been a part of the Owner-Operator Independent Driver Association since 1996, and then became the executive vice president of that organization in 2018. I would like to welcome Mr. Pugh and thank him for coming to testify on this very important issue on the supply chain and answer questions on how we can improve it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Burleson. And with that introduction, Mr. Pugh, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for this opportunity to share the views of nation's small business truckers and independent drivers. My name is Louis Pugh. I am the Executive Vice President of the Owner-Operator Independent Drivers Association. We represent 150,000 men and women making their living behind the wheel. Prior to serving as Executive Vice President at OOIDA, I spent 23 years as a professional driver, owner of a small business trucking company with 2.5 million miles of safe driving. I did begin my trucking career in the United States Army as a truck driver. Throughout my career, I have firsthand experience of many of these pervasive problems that are affecting our supply chain today. As the subcommittee works to understand what's led to the supply chain challenges and how they can be fixed, I strongly encourage you to listen to the men and women who are out there on the road every day. The challenges and the difficulty that they experience directly contribute to this overarching supply chain problems we see today. Over 70% of America's freights transported exclusively by truck. Additionally, 96% of trucking companies are small business with 6 trucks or fewer. To put it simply, small business trucking is the backbone of the American supply chain. Unfortunately, if you ask any trucker, they will tell you their needs and concerns have fallen to the lowest priority among workers in the supply chain. Lawmakers and regulators have long prioritized corporate carriers, law enforcement agency, safety advocacy groups, along with shippers and receivers over the truckers when developing supply chain policies. This has led to an increasingly difficult environment for both professional drivers and small business trucking. Let's consider the facts. Truckers struggle to find a safe place to park, wasting nearly an hour of productive time each day searching for a place to rest. They are routinely denied access to restrooms at the facilities where they pick up and deliver. Detention time, which is the unproductive time they waste at shippers and receivers waiting to be unloaded, continues to increase, and many of these truckers are not paid for these hours due to there's federal regulation exempting employee drivers from overtime pay. In fact, drivers' compensation has been stagnant for decades, failing to even keep up with inflation. There have never been more regulations imposed on our industry, and truckers are complying with these rules at an extremely high rate, yet crash rates continue to increase. And despite no requirement to do so, the administration is moving forward with an extremely unpopular speed limiter mandate that will slow the movement of freight, increase crash rates, and worsen driver recruitment and retention. EPA has launched a multifaceted attack on vehicles our members operate, dramatically will increase the cost and purchase and operation of trucks. Commercial driver's licenses are being issued in record numbers, but turnover rates remain large among large carriers of over 90%, some exceeding 100. Instead of taking the steps to reduce this, large carriers are trying and epically failing to bring teenagers in to the long-haul industry despite the obvious safety problems this creates. How can anyone be expected to operate efficiently under these conditions? I would actually like to see you or your colleagues try to get any work done if you didn't have a safe place to rest at night. If you showed up here for work at 9 a.m. in the morning, we're not allowed to do anything till early afternoon, all while not being allowed to use the restroom or being paid for that time you wasted. If you really listen to what truckers have been trying to tell you, it isn't hard to see why our supply chain is lacking. Thankfully, there are some members in the committee that have heard what truckers have been saying and have introduced legislation to make meaningful improvements. We encourage everyone to support H.R. 2367, the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act. Co-sponsor H.R. 3039, which will prevent FMCSA from imposing the speed limiter mandate. Vote for HJ Resolution 53, which will nullify EPA's NOx rules, which will dramatically increase costs and burdens of small regulations. Support legislations to ensure our members have restroom access, and co-sponsor legislation that will reduce unproductive detention time by removing the exemption from the Fair Labor Standards Act. I thank you for this opportunity to testify, and I hope you understand I'm here to convey to you what millions of truckers have been saying for far too long.
Well done, right on time. I didn't even have to tap you. Perfect. Ms. Ranky, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, and members of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today to highlight the important role that logistics companies play in the supply chain and how our members were part of the solution during the pandemic. I will also address a few challenges to the safety of the supply chain and free flow of freight and some potential pragmatic solutions. My name is Ann Ranky. I'm the President and CEO of the Transportation Intermediaries Association, or TIA. I'm honored to be here today to represent our more than 2,000 member companies. TIA is the professional organization of the $232 billion third-party logistics industry. Our members sit at the center of the supply chain, ensuring that freight is facilitated from origin to destination in the safest and most economical way possible. Every Fortune 500 company uses the services of one or more brokers to handle their traffic allocation needs. Logistics within the United States and throughout the world play an integral role in the overall American economy. From our members' perspective, the supply chain disruptions resulting from the pandemic have eased, but several residual impacts remain, including a freight recession impacting buyers, suppliers, and other key stakeholders, volatile labor markets with labor shortages still in trucking and other modes, but layoffs in some notable U.S. economic sectors, and inflation, which has increased the cost of labor, goods, and energy. Freight rates and volumes have declined over the last quarter or more, and a soft freight economy is anticipated into 2024. But that nevertheless, TIA applauds the Biden administration for its Flow Data initiative and the actions of this committee for its attention to the supply chain, a recognition of how critical it is to the U.S. economy. While all of this uncertainty looms on the horizon, the 3PL marketplace, though down right now, shows strong future growth. The pandemic showcased the broker's inherent value, driven by our members' investments in technology and our vast array of shipper and carrier relationships. The broker freight marketplace grew over 30% from 2020 to 2022. Shippers continue to look for transportation solutions to fill their needs while highlighting safety and security as the top reasons for what they look for in a broker. And carriers rely on brokers to be their sales force and connect them with shippers. Today, brokers handle about 30% of the freight in the supply chain, and it's anticipated to grow to 45% by 2045. There are two issues currently that impact the safety and efficiency of the supply chain that the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration must prioritize. First, as you know, NHTSA has noted that truck crashes continue to rise by double digits year over year. However, most trucking companies fail to receive a compliance safety audit, leading to 92% of carriers being unrated. TIA has pushed for many years for a more robust and effective motor carrier safety rating process to improve highway safety and eliminate confusion. Today's physical audits on trucking companies are outdated, ineffective, and resource constrained. TIA has fully endorsed and supports the bipartisan legislation H.R. 915, supported by Congressman Moulton and Gallagher. We applaud their leadership and would request the committee to include this legislation in the upcoming FAA Reauthorization Act or another appropriate vehicle. Second, we are in the midst of a fraud epidemic in the supply chain, which interrupts the safe chain of custody of the nation's freight and is estimated to cost brokers, carriers, shippers, and consumers around $800 million or more. TIA successfully advocated to have language included in 2012's MAP 21 that codified legal brokerage, created a $10,000 penalty for conducting illegal brokerage activities, and formed a national consumer complaint database to report fraud cases. Unfortunately, due to a lack of enforcement, there are a proliferation of bad actors in the supply chain illegally brokering freight, registering as carriers using hundreds of different MC numbers, and conducting outright freight fraud, theft, and holding freight hostage. Today, there are over 80,000 complaints in the database that have never been investigated, and no penalties have ever been assessed. Exacerbating the potential for fraud is the rise in unlicensed and unregulated dispatch services who are hired to help carriers to perform back office functions but often broker freight without authority, even sensitive government freight, and who may not be domiciled in the United States. We are working with OOIDA and NASTC to drive greater attention and some sense of urgency to this issue. We hope this hearing spurs federal attention and resources to both of these critical issues. I appreciate the opportunity to testify before the committee today, and I would be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Reinke. Mr. Fialkov, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Holmes Norton. It's a privilege to be asked to testify, one that I do not take lightly. That's particularly true with this committee, which has such a long history of pursuing bipartisan solutions to some of the country's most pressing problems. Your work this year on the supply chain lives up to that reputation, and I'm happy to be contributing to that dialogue here today. My name is David Fialkov. I'm the EVP of Government Affairs at NATSO and SIGMA, two national trade associations that represent something in the neighborhood of 80% of retail sales of motor fuel in the United States, and therefore obviously play a critical role in facilitating the efficient movement of goods and people and energy throughout the country. You can have an efficient fuel distribution system and still have supply chain problems. But you cannot have an effective, well-functioning supply chain unless you have an efficient fuel distribution system. And that's the role that our membership plays. We get fuel to where drivers need it. Doesn't matter what the fuel is, right? People can buy gasoline or ethanol or diesel or biodiesel, electricity or hydrogen. We do not care what people buy when they come to our store. We've worked very closely with this committee and with the administration on EV charging grant programs, which we have supported. We think that the existing refueling network represents a logical place to site EV charging stations. And our membership wants to be able to sell consumers the fuel that they want to buy long into the future. One of the challenges that we have found policymakers have had difficulty navigating is the balance between incentivizing investments in alternative fuels for the future without excessively disrupting the existing energy and fuel markets that the supply chain relies upon today. For example, when we pursue policies that are designed to expedite the phase-out of liquid fuel, whether that policy is right, wrong, or indifferent, the result is that refiners are far less inclined to invest in expanding refining capacity. Those tend to be very capital-intensive investments. They tend to have very long return horizons. And the result is that we have the dynamic that we have today, which is that there's just less slack in the system than there has historically been. When things are going smoothly, people tend not to worry about it or think about it. Prices are stable, supply is plentiful. But when something goes wrong, whether it's a hurricane or a pipeline hack or a war in Europe or a refinery outage, we have fewer backup options at our disposal than we historically have had. During these scenarios, we work very closely with FMCSA and EPA and others to try to identify policy impediments that can artificially exacerbate the impact on consumers that these supply disruptions have. And in our experience, we think that those officials, state and federal, should have more flexibility to waive things like the hours of service regulations and the weight regulations in order to overcome supply disruptions. Another important impediment to the efficient supply chain that we think will have increasing problems going forward is the preferential tax treatment for sustainable aviation fuel relative to other biofuels that utilize the same feedstock inputs. Sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, is basically a renewable jet fuel that indisputably has fewer environmental benefits than renewable diesel fuels do, and indisputably costs more money to make. Yet policy right now is driving biofuel producers to make SAF rather than renewable diesel. And the result of that will be that diesel emissions will go up and diesel prices will go up. And when that happens, it obviously tends to have an infectious inflationary impact throughout the entire economy because of how many goods are moved by truck. Beyond some of these kind of fuel market concerns, we commend the committee for compiling a comprehensive package of policies that are designed to alleviate supply chain constraints. One issue that's obviously near and dear to NATSA members' heart is the truck parking legislation that Congressman Bost and Representative Craig have been developing. We support that bill. We encourage the committee to pass that bill as soon as possible. Truck drivers need safe, reliable parking. The supply chain relies upon truck drivers having safe, reliable parking, and we're happy to be supportive of that effort. Finally, more broadly, I think that to effectively address a lot of the bottlenecks in the supply chain, the committee has to find a way to address labor shortages, affecting not only the trucking industry, but many businesses throughout the country. We're supportive of a lot of the concepts that have been considered thus far to encourage more men and women to become truck drivers, and we look forward to working with you on that as well. Thank you very much for inviting me to testify again. Look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you. Mr. Scandalia, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Chairman Crawford, Ranking Member Norton, Ranking Member Larson, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify at today's hearing on behalf of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters and General President Sean O'Brien. Teamsters represent 1.2 million hardworking people in the United States, Canada, and Puerto Rico, and we are the largest union in the freight industry. It would be remiss if I didn't mention that as we sit here today, General President O'Brien is busy negotiating the national UPS contract, which is the largest private collective bargaining agreement in North America. We have approximately 350,000 Teamsters at UPS, which is the largest trucking company on the planet by revenue. It's no coincidence that unionized UPS provides roughly twice the pay and benefits to its drivers as non-union Amazon and FedEx. Fundamentally, we believe that good jobs and good working conditions in the freight industry directly translate to a stronger supply chain. Many of these issues we'll discuss today are not any more complicated than that simple fact. At the Teamsters, we know what it takes to bring new, safe drivers into the industry. Through the Biden administration's Trucking Action Plan, Teamsters Local 776 stood up a new registered apprenticeship program in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, in record time that is delivering high-quality training and careers to future freight drivers. Long before the crisis, the Teamsters have taken a proactive role in training the next generation of drivers, and today operate 21 CDL training programs across 11 states that provide the opportunity for a prosperous future and the ability to provide for one's family. Our track record of training safe drivers for good careers is unparalleled, and we welcome the opportunity to work with Congress and the Department of Transportation to identify strategies and funding streams to allow us to reach more individuals. We also strongly support efforts to identify and train future CDL holders from non-traditional driving backgrounds. The Teamsters are proud to serve on DOT's Women of Trucking Advisory Board and look forward to the important task of increasing the pipeline of female drivers. There are also ample opportunities to provide better pathways to bring veterans into the freight industry. The Teamsters have endorsed the bipartisan Veteran Improvement Commercial Driver's License Act, introduced last Congress by Senators Fisher and Padilla, which would improve veterans' access to CDL training schools. We also thank Representatives Edwards, Pappas, and Crane for the reintroduction of that bill this year. We expect that today's hearing will delve substantially into the question of a driver shortage. We've all heard the industry data on turnover rates and unfilled positions. We ask that you interrogate this raw data. Why is it that carriers are reporting such difficulties recruiting, and why is it that so many people don't stay in the industry? We know that drivers with strong IBT bargain contracts that provide good wages, employer-paid health care, and dignified retirement stay in their jobs. Truck drivers respond to the same economic incentives as employees of any other industry, and many drivers who leave are doing so in response to untenable economic circumstances. It is not enough to just funnel more drivers into a broken pipeline. We must address the root causes of these challenges. From the Teamsters' perspective, we can't have this conversation without discussing the scourge of illegal independent contracting. Independent contractors generally do not receive protections and benefits under federal law, including overtime, unemployment insurance, workers' comp, Social Security, and the right to join a union. For the illegally misclassified driver, this puts their livelihoods and economic future in jeopardy. Worsening conditions are also apparent across the industry. For example, Amazon's delivery service partners and freight service partner programs have managed to combine an abuse of the independent contractor model with unacceptable safety records. Recent reporting showed that Amazon's freight service partners, driving semi-trailers, had some of the worst safety records of the industry and employ drivers who were started for violations at a rate 70 times higher than Teamster-represented UPS drivers. A strong supply chain also depends on both a healthy and safe workforce. The Teamsters unequivocally reject purported safe supply chain solutions rooted in watering down training standards, attacking fatigue protections, and putting heavier, more dangerous trucks on our interstates. Pushing drivers to and past the limits of safety is never a salve for corporate shortcomings. We think there are common sense bipartisan solutions here, but not by putting our members and the general public in harm's way. I also have to add that despite the claims of Silicon Valley venture capitalists, it would be irresponsible for Congress to abandon its responsibility to improving working conditions in the hopes that automated freight is around the corner, as discussed at length in my written testimony. As Congress considers automated vehicles, it is critical that Congress focuses on issues of safety as well as impact to workers across the freight sector. To close, the supply chain is not partisan. We believe that there are areas of common ground where we can work together to improve circumstances for both our members and Americans across the country who rely on the work that we do. The International Brotherhood of Teamsters thanks the committee for the opportunity to testify in the state of our supply chain, and we look forward to working together on these issues going forward.
Thank you. And now turn our attention to questions from the panel. I'll recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to put this question to everybody, and we'll start with you, Mr. Pugh. But I'd like for you to speak to what you think is the biggest regulation you see coming out of the DOT that makes it harder to move goods efficiently and safely through our nation's supply chain.
Probably at the present time, the largest thing we see is speed limiters coming out of DOT. For one, it's going to create a speed differential across the country, and which, as someone who's driven truck, I lived in a state that had split speed limit for years and years and years. It does create unsafety. It creates lots more interactions between trucks and cars, first of all. It creates a lot of upset other car drivers. I'm sure we've all taken a trip somewhere across this country and got behind a couple trucks. It takes 8 or 10 miles to pass one past the other, and a lot of times those trucks are speed limited. There is all kinds of research and studies out there that show that when traffic all travels the same speed, it's much safer for everyone, all the motoring public. This is also going to make it just add to the retention problem we have. I get all the time from the agency that they want to hear from truck drivers. When they came out with this and asked for comments, they received 16,000 comments from truckers. Mass majority were against this. They're still moving forward. And this is what I hear from my members all the time. We don't interact with government, we don't do it because why bother? Because they don't listen anyway when we do. 16,000 comments is record setting. So, and then the final thing I will say with the speed limiter, if you do slow all these trucks down to 60 mile per hour, which is what we've heard, that's going to take more trucks to move the same amount of freight because we're going to become less efficient. So again, that just adds to the more and more of the congestion problem we see on the highway.
Gotcha. Ms. Reinke.
Thank you, Chairman, for the question. There's nothing currently pending that we feel is going to inhibit our members' progress, but far be it for me to say that there should be no more regulations promulgated, but we would like them to enforce the regulations they already have. So for example, when I talked about fraud, they have not investigated 80,000 complaints, never. There's never been an enforcement action, and there's never been an investigation. And we hear from the FMCSA that they believe that they cannot enforce civil penalties. There's a ALJ ruling that would prohibit them. However, they could do other things. They could take a motor carrier out of service. They could assess other penalties. So they're not doing that. On safety, as I mentioned, there's 92% of the trucks that aren't rated because they have this antiquated physical audit system. Well, surely they could update that. They could modernize that so that it's not just 5,000 trucks that they actually audit every year, that would do a far greater body of work. So that's what we're hopeful of and wishing for.
Thank you. Mr. Fialko.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Top of mind now are probably an effort to remove some of the flexibility that has been utilized in terms of waiving restrictions on weight and hours of service in response to supply chain disruptions, particularly in terms of motor fuel. Just to illustrate an example, diesel fuel weighs more than gasoline does. So under current weight laws, you're not allowed to fill a transport truck with diesel fuel before you hit your weight. So if there's a hurricane and you're trying to get diesel to an area, it's really helpful to be able to waive that limitation so that you can move an extra 1,000 gallons of diesel in every truckload. Whenever we are in the trenches trying desperately with FMCSA and others to get fuel to places that are running out of it and growing desperate, I have never worked with a government official who was happy to be hamstrung in their ability to inject flexibility into that process. I'm supportive of your effort to push back on that.
Gotcha. Mr. Scandalia.
Yeah, I think when we think about this question, we think about regulatory efforts that make trucking a worse place to work. And so I think we would talk specifically about FMCSA's 2018 determination to vastly expand the scope of its preemption authority in the face of decades of precedent, as well as FMCSA's decision to make modifications to the hours of service rules in 2020.
Thank you. I will now recognize Ranking Member Norton.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pugh and Mr. Scandalia, at the full committee supply chain hearing earlier this Congress, we heard about a working shortage in the trucking industry. Yet both of your organizations have argued that we do not have a worker shortage. We have a worker retention problem. In your view, what are the top reasons truck drivers do not stay in their jobs?
Yes, thank you, Ranking Member Norton. The first and foremost is driver pay. There's plenty of research, plenty of studies out there. The pay is one driver's top concern. Actually, past year, it was pay and parking were the two reasons, the biggest problems that drivers face. Because again, truckers' pay has not kept up with inflation since the 1970s. And it continues to go down. And like I mentioned in my testimony, truck drivers are exempt from overtime, which is ridiculous when they work 70, 80 hours a week every week. The average trucking week, they're allowed to drive 70 hours. So,
Mr. Scandalia?
Yeah, I think we fundamentally agree with Mr. Pugh there. I think low wages for very hard work is the biggest issue that we face when it comes to retention. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I would also include the widespread impacts of illegal driver misclassification in that category as well.
Mr. Uda and the Teamsters, women in the workforce, that's what this question is about. The bipartisan infrastructure law directed the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to establish the Women of Trucking Advisory Board to encourage women to enter the trucking field. The board has been formed, and I'm eager to hear their recommendations and findings. After all, women only make up 6.6% of the truck driver workforce. Mr. Pugh and Mr. Scandalia, the women of Trucking, the Women of Trucking Advisory Board includes representatives that are independent owner-operators as well as officials from the Teamsters. What actions are your organizations taking to improve the participation of women in the trucking workforce?
Two big actions is one, Congressman Boss parking bill, because we need safe places, women especially, to park out there. And also Congressman Nell's getting ready for a bill on restroom access. It's a huge problem for women and men in trucking. At a lot of places that they deliver and pick up at, they're not allowed to use the restroom.
Mr. Scandalia?
We conduct our own CDL training programs at the IBT where we can bring folks into our industry. So through these programs, our training programs, we can target a diverse workforce, including women, instead of relying on our employers to do it for us. And I would also add that the benefit of a union contract is that when we negotiate language, we guarantee equal pay, access to medical benefits, paid leave, parental leave, that all, I think, incentivize women to enter the industry, at least through unionized driving.
Mr. Pugh and Mr. Scandalia, between your organizations, you represent a significant portion of the trucking workforce. You have a vested interest in ensuring the safety of motor vehicles. Can you each speak to the importance of entry-level driver training and how it improves the safety of our roads and helps retain workers in the trucking sector?
I think as far as entry-level driver training, it needs to be stricter, and we need stronger standards and probably more minimal time. State of Missouri takes 1,600 hours to cut hair. There's no set standard for driving a truck. I think we're setting ourselves up for failure. That's one thing we could help. If you train people how to do things and they feel comfortable what they do, they generally stay with that occupation.
Mr. Scandalia?
You know, when entry-level driver training is conducted properly, we can guarantee that regardless of where someone is being trained or who is training them, that they have a baseline level of competency and a core competency and be comfortable in their experience as they become commercial drivers.
Gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Boss is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pugh, I'd like to start off by asking you some clarifying questions, if I can, about truck parking. Why do you see trucks parked along highway shoulders, and how do you know that there's a shortage?
Well, you see trucks parked all over the shoulder in all these different places because they have nowhere else to go. Truckers are mandated by hours of service on time they can drive and time they must rest. And the problem is that there's only one spot for 11 trucks right now. This has been a problem my entire career, and it's kind of crisis stage now. Lots of folks out there, I know they see these big warehouses and gas stations and all these different places where drivers can park, or they think that drivers can park, I guess would be the better statement. Unfortunately, a lot of these places and businesses do not allow this. Some, it's who owns the land, it's the real estate company, some is just policy. I have drivers who go to places, they sit there for 6-8 hours waiting to get unloaded, they run out of hours, and then the place where they deliver kick them off the property, tell them they have to leave. They'll explain, and I've had this happen to myself, I'm out of hours, there's nowhere else, I can't drive. Well, we don't know what to tell you because you're not parking here. This has been a while ago, but I was ticketed in the state of Massachusetts at 3 a.m. because I was parked on the car side on a toll plaza. It was 3 a.m., nobody in there. I pulled off there to take a break at like 10:30, 11 o'clock at night. I woke up at 3 a.m. by an enforcement officer giving us $80 parking ticket and told I need to go on down the road. After explaining to this officer that I'm out of hours, he didn't care. Go on to Boston or wherever you're going. So this is a real problem, and this is why we need parking.
So also, how does the lack of trucking parking create stress for drivers and make their job more difficult? And is this just a problem for drivers, or does it cause safety hazards for others as well?
Well, truckers want to be safe more than anybody out there. That's their office. It's where they work out there on the highway, and it's very stressful. I don't know if anyone's ever went on vacation and, didn't make hotel arrangements and hunting around for a motel, and you're trying to find a place to sleep, and it's hard, and that happens to normal people. This happens to truckers every day. They can't find a place, they want to take a break, maybe they want to be an hour down the road. Truckers, a lot of times, are paid by the mile, so they want to be as efficient in their day as they can be. But a lot of times they have to stop short, maybe 100, 150 miles. They have to do things they don't want to do. For myself, again, for an example, I used to live in New York City a lot. I like to go in at night and park. The place I went, I was able to do, or there was 24-hour. But a lot of guys, they have to stay 100 miles out, and then they end up going in the morning across the GW Bridge with everybody else because there's no safe place for them to get closer to their delivery. And that's not only dangerous for them, but it's dangerous for the motor public because they do need their rest, and they deserve their rest.
Thank you. Mr. Fialco, can you please talk about NATSO and SIGMA members and how they could work with local stakeholders if Congress would finally act and provide dedicated funding for truck parking?
Sure. Thank you, Congressman. As you know, the private sector currently provides north of 90% of truck parking capacity in the country. But it's a complicated and expensive business, right? And I'm not just talking about land acquisition, which tends to be exceedingly expensive in the areas where there are more acute shortages. And the expense of concrete, trucks beat up a parking lot more than light-duty vehicles do, as you can imagine. So you have to have a lot more concrete, ongoing maintenance, lighting, security, and whatnot. But there's also a lot of local opposition quite frequently, right? Everyone wants more truck parking spaces. Very few people want them next to their house. So there's a lot of complexity and expense associated with working with local kind of communities and towns to try to convince them of the upside to allow truck parking. And the idea of working with rather than against the government in those endeavors is very appealing to us.
I'm short on time. I'm going to ask another question for Ms. Rinke. I'll submit it for the record. But one statement I wanted to make, because a question that was asked earlier about why we lose truck drivers and why we have a truck driver shortage. Many of you know that I was born and raised in the trucking business. My family's still in it. The one thing that people don't understand that we keep losing a lot of drivers to is the legalization of marijuana in states around this country. And and if you want to smoke it, I don't care. But the rules are very clear. You smoke it, you can't pop positive, or you're going to pop positive for 30 days after smoking it. And several drivers are making choices to go ahead and party rather than drive. That's causing a problem in our shortage today, and we've got to deal with it somehow. Now, I don't know what that is or how that is. It's very frustrating that they make the choice, but if you drink a beer on a Sunday, you can drive on Monday. You smoke a joint on Friday night, you ain't driving for another 30 days. And I don't agree with the legalization of marijuana, but something's got to be done to figure this out. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. And I recognize Mr. Menendez for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate all the witnesses coming here today and the careers and professions that you all represent in your various capacities. Trucking is often framed as a great career path where people can start earning high salaries without a college degree, which is something that we should continue to develop and pursue greater pathways. But we also know that trucking is not an easy job. So I want to talk about some of the experiences your members have had on the road and some of the challenges that they face, because I think one of the things that we've highlighted is there's a retention problem that isn't just about the legalization of marijuana. Mr. Scandalia, what's the average cost to earn and maintain a CDL?
The average cost to
procure and maintain a CDL?
I'm not sure I have that data in front of me today. I'd have to get back to you.
A couple $1,000s maybe to?
That's probably reasonable.
Yeah.
Though I will say at a number of Teamster-operated schools, we do offer CDL training free of charge to the trainee.
It's great, and we appreciate Teamsters doing that. And for other people, they may not have that access, so it's a great thing that Teamsters provides. And also, sticking with you, just generally, how much time do your members spend away from their families when they're on the job?
So for Teamsters members who are largely concentrated in the less than truckload sector of the trucking industry, actually most of our members come home at night. Not all, but the vast majority of our members are not performing some of the long-haul, over-the-road operations that some of Mr. Pugh's members are.
And Mr. Pugh, some of your members who are on the long haul side would be about away from their families for about how long on average?
I beg your pardon?
The folks that are on the long haul side of this, how many days would they spend away from their families when they're on the job?
How many days away they're the
Yeah.
week? Yeah, usually probably 5 days a week. Leave on Sunday, get home on Friday. That's my way I work myself.
Yeah, so significant time away from their families. And there's also additionally the physical and mentally demanding aspect of this job, like driving in bad weather and transporting hazardous materials and dangerous substances. Is that correct, Mr. Pugh?
Yes, my members transport all types of substances across the country, flatbed, tanker, van, reefer, everything.
All right. And so this morning, we've heard several testimonies that describe a driver shortage and the need to recruit younger drivers to address this workforce issue, which is definitely one of the mechanisms that we need to pursue. But Mr. Scandalia, in your testimony, you describe a retention problem rather than a recruitment problem. So I wanted to highlight some of the challenges in this industry that drivers face. If we focus all of our efforts just on recruitment, will we have enough drivers to meet the current demand?
I don't think just shoving more drivers into a broken pipeline is the answer. During 2021, for example, states were issuing 50,000 new CDLs a month. And yet, from the data we're seeing from the industry, at least on the truckload side, we're reporting no meaningful improvements in turnover and the purported shortage. So I think this is why it's so important for Congress and for regulators to have a conversation about why those drivers are leaving instead of just coming up with more ways to force more people into the industry.
Right, burnout, fatigue, lack of appropriate benefits would be some of the reasons that they may not stay in the industry.
Absolutely.
So when we think about recruitment, it's about improving the quality of the job and the experience to reward that hard work, the time, 5 days a week that they're spending away from their families. And if we recognize the sacrifices that go into this job, maybe we would have higher retention if we pursue fair wages, reasonable hours, high-quality benefits, paid leave, and correct worker classification. Would that help with some of the retention issues that you're seeing?
Undoubtedly. And I think when you look at Teamsters represented chunks of the industry, you see a much lower turnover rate. The LTL industry has less than 15% turnover as a whole, and I think that number is lower at our carriers. There are other reasons why that is. I think we should be honest about that. But I do think all of the items you mentioned absolutely contribute to the question.
As well as misclassification being a significant driver. And so one of the things that I'm sure that we could do here in Congress is provide the tools that are sort of set forth in PRO Act and other pieces of legislation that would give people, tackle the misclassification problem, also give people the right to be represented by a union like yours in this industry. And creating that greater representation, I imagine, would result in a lot of these tangible benefits that would improve the quality of life and potentially create a higher retention rate than what we're currently seeing. But I'm out of time. Thank you all for your testimony, and yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Desposito is recognized for 5 minutes.
Oh, good morning, and thank you all for being here. I represent the southwest corner of Long Island, right on the border of New York City. And obviously, Long Islanders are no stranger to financial burdens passed down onto them for many different reasons. Already facing crippling state income taxes, property taxes, tolls, proposed congestion pricing, and much more, the impact of the supply chain crisis and inflation on their wallets is a family table issue and something that we hear about regularly. New York prides itself on its port industry and robust commerce, and as a matter of fact, many of the residents and constituents that I have the honor of representing are in the trucking business. Many of them operating not only on the ports along the Northeast, but having businesses as well on the West Coast. So I guess my first question is, how do you believe, just because the area that I represent is so beneficial on small business, it's truly the lifeblood of our communities. So how do you feel that the shortage in the workforce has impacted local business? And we could start on one and then kind of work our way down.
Well, I don't think there's a shortage. I think there's a retention problem, first of all. But yeah, I think the retention problem hits everybody because drivers aren't treated correctly. And then when you get to your small business truckers like you're talking about, when it comes to tolling and congestion pricing, that's a killer on small business trucking. And it's probably a killer on some Ms. Rinke's members too, because they have to try to get this into the rates. It's hard to get these tolls. I know myself in New York, I ran New York City a lot from Ohio. I spent $10,000 to $12,000 a year in just tolls. And when it comes to congestion pricing,
It's not going down.
yeah, I know. It's been up, 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 up. And with congestion pricing, it's really tough on truckers because unfortunately, most businesses are open 9 to 5, and that's when they want the trucks to come, and that's when congestion pricing. Be much better if people receive things at night because truckers would rather go in and out of the city late at night than through the day.
Thank you, Congressman. It affects our members in that there's a capacity crunch. It's not as bad right now because we have somewhat of a freight recession, but in the height of the pandemic, finding the deer capacity, whether it's a retention issue or a shortage issue, regardless, we could not find the drivers we needed. Our members pride themselves on having a good cadre of carriers that they can turn to, and if they're not there, then that affects everybody from the shipper to the consumer who can't get the toilet paper that they want on their shelves.
Right. Yeah, I think we'd agree that the retention and the shortage sort of become one at some point.
Thank you for the question. I think that by and large, fuel retailers that employ drivers are employing fuel haulers, right? Hazmat haulers. So they tend to be older. They have to go through more vigorous training, and we still have a very hard time keeping those positions filled. And that can become a problem when you have a thin staff and somebody doesn't show up to work, there's a very high turnover rate, somebody quits on the job. Suddenly you have a exceedingly difficult time identifying ways to get fuel from a terminal to a retail outlet. And as that becomes more expensive, that ultimately is absorbed by consumers, which again, as you noted, has an extraordinarily counterproductive inflationary impact on an entire economy.
Thank you.
And I have to agree with Mr. Pugh. I have no doubt that if you're a small importer on Long Island who needs to put goods on a truck and you can't access drivers, then that would be incredibly destructive for your business. But as I said earlier, I think it's critically important that we interrogate why it is that those drivers may not be available.
Thank you. And just as I mentioned when I began, I know that a lot of the trucking companies, a lot of the business owners in my district also operate on the West Coast. So, Mr. Pugh, I think you had discussed California's efforts to push electric trucks. So I know that there's a lot of skepticism, the cost, the mileage range, battery weight, safety, charging time, availability. I only have about 40 seconds left. Could you just briefly expand on that point, share with the subcommittee some examples of how these challenges are already playing out for the small business truckers, especially those who operate both here in my district on the East Coast as well as the West Coast?
Yes, there's all kinds of operational challenges, and I've said on the cardboard, and they don't have these places. They don't have these charging stations in place. They don't know if they have the grids. And then you run into these fleets. If you have a fleet in different states, a lot of times they trade equipment or use different equipment. If they have a shortage of equipment out here, they move it there, vice versa, and that's going to create that issue as well because they're not going to have electric trucks in New York, but they may have them in California.
Thank you very much. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentleman yields. Mr. Johnson, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you to the witnesses for your time and testimony. The United States is a global leader in trade and commerce. Every day, millions of tons of goods are transported across our nation's highways. These goods are essential to our economy and our way of life. Our freight supply chain is a complex system that involves many different players, including shippers, carriers, and logistic providers. It is a critical part of our economy, and it plays a vital role in keeping our shelves stocked and our businesses running. Workers are the backbone of our supply chain. Democrats have shown and proven that we support sustainable solutions to supply chain challenges that prioritize safety and truck driver quality of life. Legislative proposals that undermine safety or threaten worker rights in the name of productivity are short-sighted and will weaken the supply chain. Mr. Scandaglia, we can all agree that ensuring that we have the capacity to get the nation's commerce where it needs to go is, or at least should be, a top priority for us all. However, given that we're seeing record increases in highway fatalities, I'm very concerned about proposals to weaken hours of service protections or extend the amount of time a driver can be on the road or on duty. What would it mean to your members if Congress or regulators allowed longer work days for commercial truck drivers? And how would weakening hours of service protection impact safety and workforce retention?
Thank you for the question, Congressman. I think it's a very important topic that you've brought up. I think sometimes we get in the bad habit of thinking about regulations as solely as they affect productivity or solely as they affect how a business is able to get something from point A to point B. But the regulations that you've discussed, including hours of service protections, are basic fatigue protections. It's how we keep our members safe. And when Congress or regulators makes bad changes to our hours of service protections, the direct result is more fatigue drivers on the road. And we know from years of data that fatigue is one of the most dangerous conditions drivers face. At the most extreme levels, levels of fatigue have similar effects on drivers as alcohol intoxication. So I think there are a lot of things that Congress can look at, but decreasing safety on our nation's roadways, particularly for the reasons you highlighted, is going to be unacceptable for the Teamsters.
Thank you. Mr. Pugh, highway safety has always been a priority of mine, and that is why I have not only supported legislation, but also led legislation to ensure that drivers on our roads are protected. Recent studies show an increase in the number of trucks on the road, limited space for parking, and restrictive regulations on where trucks can park overnight. In your testimony, you stated that drivers are forced to spend more and more of their on-duty time finding a place to park rather than keeping goods moving. Is there anything that you want to add to what you have already testified to today about the challenges that small business truck owners face with limited spaces to park?
Again, I appreciate it. No, I mean, again, I think we've talked about this and how important this is to truck drivers to have a safe place and for the motoring public. I would like to add to your previous question, my members, when it comes to hours of service, they don't want to drive more. They don't want to work more. They just want to be paid for the time that they do work now and would like to have a little more flexibility to decide when it's safe for them to operate and not operate. Like, for example, they would rather not drive through Washington, D.C. traffic at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They'd rather be able to take a break for a couple hours before coming. Thank you.
Well, let me ask you this. What impact would it have if there was a push to build more places for trucks to park? What if that became a priority in this country? How would that impact your ability to move the goods?
It would definitely help move the ability and it would lessen congestion because if there's more places to park, we get at that hour that I discussed in the beginning that drivers, men and women on the wheel are wasting each day, sometimes more than that. They'd be able to get closer to where they deliver. They'd be able to get there sooner, deliver, pick up, and get out and continue moving. When you look at the amount of trucks we have on the highway and consider they each on average waste an hour a day every day, that's a lot of freight that's not being moved efficiently.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. LaMalfa is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the opportunity here today and our witnesses. For Mr. Pugh, I had a chance to speak with you a little bit. In California, of course, we have to be always leading the way on dumb ideas, but we're forcing this electric mandate on so many vehicles, including trucks, and our chairman spoke about that a little bit in the fact that trucks will now be heavier, so you either have to raise the weight limits of what the truck weighs to carry the same amount of cargo, or have more truck traffic, because now instead of 80,000 pounds with a net of 58,000, you're gonna have less net cargo, so it's gonna require more truck trips. So tell us what you know more so about the costs of doing this, not only to the individual, maybe mom and pop truckers, but also the infrastructure it's going to take to be able to service them and keep them moving on a trip.
Yes, you're correct. If we go to EVs, EV trucks are way heavier. And so, yeah, that leaves us, like you said, two examples. We're either going to have to give them a weight exemption, or there's going to be less freight moved. When it comes to these other EPA rules and stuff we're seeing, and I urge everyone to support Representative Nell's Resolution 53. Small business truckers, they can't afford a lot of this stuff because it continually gets dumped on them. And unfortunately, this stuff isn't proven. That's the problem here. It's not more efficient. It costs more. It costs more to purchase. It's not as dependable. It's more downtime, more parts, more repairs, longer times in repair shops. We saw this in 2011. They were forced mandates on the manufacturers. The end consumers had to buy these things, and unfortunately, they weren't ready for prime time. They weren't tested, and here we are. America was founded on capitalism and business innovating and finding things. Trucking is a business. If the manufacturers come up with more efficient things, whether that's electric, hydrocarbon, whatever, I'm not a scientist, but I do know that truckers will buy it because it's a business. And any way that they can make more profit by lowering their expenses, they'll do that. But the way that's done is through the free market and by coming up with things that we know that work, and not using truckers and motor carriers as guinea pigs.
Yeah, well, indeed, if we were just updating the fleet we have more and more with the clean burning vehicles we have, as phasing them in, you wouldn't need this. But we don't get any credit for work we've done in the past. So let's talk about the speed limiting that they're proposing here. Now, in my experience on I-5 in California, or the 5 as they call it in LA, that you end up with these turtle races. One truck's going 54.9, the other one wants to pass them going 55. It takes 2 or 3 miles for the pass to be completed. And you got cars behind, and that want to go 70 or more that are getting frustrated, and they start doing weird things, because they get impatient with all that. So the truckers have governors on them in a lot of cases, that one governor might be set a certain way and another might be 55, and one might be at 56, so they're trying to pass each other. Talk to me about this further push on truck speed limit devices and how that's, this on the heels of ELD devices. I mean, how much watching do we need to do on you?
Yeah, again, this is a very unsafe in this rule. There's plenty of facts out there to prove and studies to show where traffic is safer, all moving at the same speed. And you are correct. The turtle races, as they're called, or elephant races, it doesn't matter. Trucks are mechanical. Nothing mechanical is a complete exact science. So we can all set our trucks, everybody in this room, at 60 mile an hour, but they're not going to be exactly 60. Plus, when it comes to trucks, you throw in weight and all these other factors. If my truck load weighs 50,000 and yours weighs 55,000, and we're governed at the same speed, you're going to be able to go up a hill just a little bit faster than I am because you're a little bit lighter.
Yeah, certainly. I got a lot of hilly areas of I-5 in my district like that, and if they don't have 3 lanes, you've got elephant races, and it's very, very frustrating for everybody else. If you got, and in my state, they're limited to 55, whereas you got cars being able to go 70, and so it seems like you're adding more risk by piling everybody up that way. Go ahead and finish.
That's correct. It does cause more accidents. I'm from Ohio originally before moving to Missouri. We were a 55 for trucks, 65 for cars state for a long, long time. The state finally made everybody on the turnpike let them go 70 for a test, and it wasn't long till the whole state went to that because they found out that accidents went down significantly.
At what rate, sir?
Beg your pardon?
At what rate for everybody? They adjusted the speed to be the same for everybody?
Yes, they adjusted the speed after they did a pilot program on the
And
Ohio
what
Turnpike.
speed did they adjust it?
70 mile per hour, because, again, states probably know better what trucks should go than we do here in Washington.
Most of them. I wouldn't count my state as one of them, so anyway, thank you.
Gentleman's time's expired. Mr. Garcia, you are recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to all the witnesses this morning. Supply chain challenges and bottlenecks over the past few years have presented a number of critical issues in the trucking industry. However, improving the supply chain issues should not compromise safety on our roads. Pose the first question to Mr. Scandaglia. Would you agree that providing U.S. DOT with unfettered and poorly defined authority to waive truck size and weight requirements would undermine decades of regulation on maximum truck size and weight?
We would agree unequivocally. It's evident, I think, both in the research that has been done at DOT and elsewhere, as well as when we talk to our own members, that there are substantial safety challenges associated with larger, heavier trucks. I don't think that's up for debate, in our opinion. And we understand that in certain circumstances, there are regulations that exist to contemplate emergency scenarios. But giving DOT the authority and giving the Secretary the authority to waive truck weight for anyone who happens to walk in the door would be a mistake, in our opinion.
Okay. Thank you for that. And what recommendation, if you would provide that, would you give to Congress to ensure safe truck size and weight maximums?
I think we would advise that if Congress is considering making changes to truck size and weight, that they talk to truck drivers before they do it.
Thank you. Mr. Pugh, it's my understanding that OIDA supports the DRIVE Act, a bill that would prohibit the FMCSA from implementing any rule or regulation requiring vehicles over 26,000 pounds that are engaged in interstate commerce to be equipped with the speed limiting device set to a maximum period. Is this true? And don't you think the bill will compromise safety on our roads?
Yes, it is true. OIDA does support that bill. We support because our members, who are all truck drivers out there, they tell us, I have the experience as well, traffic, as was said in here multiple times now, is much safer when everyone's going the same speed limit and there's no differential. I think there's plenty of studies. I think we're down to, 6 states or something, or 7 states that have split speed limits. In 1995, the states were given the authority to set their speed limits, and we feel, as an association and as our members, that, again, states probably know what the safe speed limit is for traffic to be moving in their state better than other folks do outside of that state.
Okay, thank you. Back to Mr. Scandaglia. As a former Teamster myself, I've always prioritized the quality of life for workers in the transportation industry. As it stands now, Teamsters contracts require drivers to be paid for the time they spend waiting, and as a result, detention time is less common for drivers that you represent. If paying drivers for detention time became the industry standard, what safety or driver retention benefits would you expect or would result from this?
I think we would see substantial safety benefits. Like you mentioned, most Teamster drivers, per the terms of their contracts, are going to be paid for any time that they spend in detention. But I think, broadly speaking, when you are forcing drivers into difficult situations where they're, say, sitting in a port for 4 hours before they can drive again, and before they can make money, you're incentivizing unsafe choices. And to the broader question, you're hurting retention. Someone who sits at a port for 5 hours every day might look up one day and decide, this job's not for me. So I think by covering things like detention time, potentially from a federal perspective, we could address multiple problems simultaneously.
Thank you for your insight, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Stauber recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and to the witnesses, thanks for spending some time with us here this morning. I will tell you that I first want to talk about, Mr. Pugh, you talked about the truck parking. I want you all to know that Mike Bost has that resolution, piece of legislation, the Truck Parking Safety Improvement Act, and I'm a co-sponsor of it. I left Des Moines, Iowa at 5:30. I live in northern Minnesota. I left Des Moines, Iowa at 5:30 on Sunday. And between 7 and 9 o'clock, I saw 2 rest stops with trucks and trailers parked on the off ramp into the rest stop, trucks parked in the rest stops, and trucks parked onto the on ramp to the rest stops. So, Mr. Pugh, to your comments, we need more truck parking, and I think that piece of legislation will help get it started. And that's only just my small piece of southern Minnesota as I'm traveling through, so I appreciate you mentioning that. Ms. Ranke, I've been a strong supporter of the need to establish a motor carrier safety selection standard. Could you elaborate on how the current lack of standards impacts the supply chain?
Absolutely. So as I mentioned in my testimony, thank you for the question, and thank you for your support of HR 915. And as I mentioned in my testimony, the FMCSA can get to maybe 5,000 inspections a year. And so there are upwards of 500,000 motor carriers. So that means the vast majority of motor carriers are not rated. They don't receive a safety rating when they're new entrants into the marketplace, which they're supposed to after 90 days. They don't receive a follow-up compliance review, which they're supposed to every 5 years. They just don't have the resources to do it. And why is that? Because they have this requirement that they have to have a physical audit. We're not suggesting to take away a physical audit, but what we are suggesting with HR 915 is to amplify with the data that they already receive. So they already get weigh station reports, they already get state police reports, they already get state inspection reports. Use that data, filter it up to determine who's at risk and determine if it's up or down, meaning are they safe to travel on the nation's highways or are they not? And HR 915, while that rulemaking is promulgated, would establish a minimum standard. Because right now, our members don't have to check anything in order to hire a carrier. That doesn't seem to promote safety. And so HR 915 would provide this interim standard while that rulemaking is pending.
Thank you. Well said.
Thank you.
A similar provision to the Motor Carrier Safety Selected Standard Act was attached to the last House, which passed the FAA bill in 2018. Ms. Ranke, again, can you explain why this is germane to both the highway subcommittees and the aviation subcommittees?
Yes, sir. And as you noted, there is a long history of motor carrier provisions being inserted as part of a larger aviation bill, from the F4A Act in 1994 to just as recently the 2018 FAA Reauthorization Act. So this precedent has been established. To the extent there are any other issues that need to be addressed, we'd be happy to work with the committee to address them.
Well, I just, in the last minute or so that I have, I just want to thank you all for your testimony, and also thank the men and women who drive these trucks and bring these products to the American people. During the pandemic, had it not been for the truckers, we would have been in dire straits. And so thank you very much. And lastly, when you talk about safety, safety is the number 1, 2, and 3 priority for you all. It's a tragedy whenever we have a crash involving a truck. In northern Minnesota, we had one last week. A 34-year-old young man lost his life. Every one of those is a tragedy. And I don't know the particulars about it, but we'll come back. And I think this, with the chair and ranking member putting safety as a priority, we're willing to work with the experts and listen and learn as we make our roads and our skies safer. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Moulton recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And I'd really like to pick up on the very point that my colleague was just discussing. Every year, there are over 100,000 truck crashes in the U.S. that result in injuries. 100,000. 4,000 of these crashes result in deaths. And what's worse is that these numbers are on the rise. Truck crashes are up 10% from 2021 to 2022. And that's why this past February, I reintroduced HR 915, the Motor Carrier Safety Selection Standard Act, alongside my colleague, Congressman Gallagher. Thank you very much for acknowledging it, Ms. Reinke, in your opening remarks. Companies rely on motor carriers to move their goods across the country, and when they enter into a contract, they assume that their products will be transported safely. Similarly, millions of Americans across the country drive alongside trucks every day, assuming that these vehicles have been made safe. Yet today, there's no way for shippers to verify the safety of their motor carriers. And America's 3 million shippers and 20,000 third-party logistics providers are not required to vet their trucking partners to ensure that they meet basic safety requirements, like having insurance and making sure their vehicles pass inspection. Hence, shippers are still able to use carriers that have been rated by the DOT as unsafe. So this bill directs the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration to amend the safety rating process for motor carriers and shift away from the outdated and ineffective current physical audit system. 92% of carriers are currently unrated. It's amazing. 92% don't even have a rating because there's not adequate staffing to go and physically inspect the trucks. So Ms. Reinke, can you expand on the current state of the antiquated physical audit system and what alternative system we should have moving forward?
Absolutely. So the physical audit system, they're required again to go out and essentially put eyeballs on the trucks, eyeballs on the records, which is all a very well-intended thing, except if you don't have a number of inspectors, which they don't, and you don't have the wherewithal to go out there because of constrained resources, which they certainly did during the pandemic. I mean, I don't know if there were any physical audits or how many there were done, but they were certainly reduced during the pandemic, of course. And so that means that they just aren't done at all. And so that doesn't seem the right outcome. And further, I would say this, because they have constrained resources, they're going to go visit the big legacy carriers. They're not going to go visit Mr. Pugh's members because they can't get to them. And so Mr. Pugh's members get disadvantaged because then you have the big guys who get rated, and then you don't have people who may be new entrants into the space who get an inspection and can validate that they have a safe rating and are safe to operate.
So while this new PHMSA rulemaking is being developed, my bill would also set an interim standard that requires brokers to do 3 things. It requires them to verify that their motor carriers are properly registered with DOT, have obtained the required insurance, and have not been determined unfit to safely operate commercial motor vehicles. So, I mean, what is the sort of practical impact of this rulemaking on the industry?
So the practical impact is that the members, you know, the guys and gals who are TIA members are already doing some freight vetting, but there are times when, because it's a last minute thing, you have to pick the carrier that you choose. This way you have some safety in knowing, all right, I gotta check these 3 things. I'm gonna feel pretty good and pretty confident that that truck's gonna get to where it's going safely. And to all of us who care about traffic and who's next to you, driving the truck next to you, I think that should give us all a peace of mind.
And just open it up to the panel, what are other things that we should do in this realm? I mean, this is ridiculous that we don't have this rulemaking, and this is essentially a patch that we're trying to provide, but we all want to be able to travel our highways more safely. So I don't know if anyone else would have a comment they would like to offer.
Well, Congressman, I think we fundamentally agree with kind of the underlying point that's being made on FMCSA clearly not having the resources to perform the oversight and the inspections that it needs to make sure that carriers are operating safely. And one thing we would particularly point to as we have seen the evolution of more complex and more convoluted contracting and subcontracting models, again, particularly at Amazon, we're very concerned about the safety records of some of those operations and of FMCSA's ability to monitor them. So making sure that we have a handle on the safety records of those systems is something that we would strongly recommend.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Gentleman from New Jersey is recognized, Mr. Van Drew.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I don't know if it's on a lighter note, but it's just an observation of mine as I drive the Beltway and go through Washington and New York and other areas, because I drive around a good deal in my neck of the woods. The only thing that seems more problematic to me than the truck drivers, frankly, they seem a lot safer and better and more organized than just the commuters who are driving back and forth. And when I look at the number of crashes that occurred It's amazing how many of those commuter crashes. You know, I live in southern New Jersey. It can take me anywhere from 3 hours to get from Washington, D.C. to way down deep South Jersey to 6 hours. And of course, last week was one of my 6-hour treks, and it's something that kind of sticks in your head. So you guys are doing a pretty good job considering the circumstances. And that's what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. I almost call this a come to God moment to some reason. You know, truck workers need to be treated fairly. I mean, let's talk about the real basic issues here. If it wasn't for truck drivers, the supply chain, and I'm saying what other people have said, we wouldn't have had a supply chain at all. So the truck drivers are the ones that went out there, did the job, and kept this country going. They need things. They need a place to park. They need to take a break. They need rest. They need help with fuel costs. They are hard workers. They break their backs. They deal with bad weather, dangerous substances, dangerous situations. But quite frankly, I've been in this Congress on my 3rd term now, and we talk about it a lot. And I know we care, and this is not a criticism. I'm pretty easy to criticize the other side. I'm not criticizing any side right now. This is just the reality. We've got to do stuff. We can't just keep talking about it. And I, for one, I do rise in support of removing the exemption under the Fair Labor Standards Act, FLSA. It denies truckers guaranteed overtime pay. Any other industry or business, when you work hours and hours over your regular time, you get paid overtime. It's only fair. And truckers work harder than just about anybody else, so it makes it even more fair. Last Congress, I co-sponsored the Guaranteeing Overtime for Truckers Act that would have eliminated FLSA's motor carrier overtime exemption, which means truck drivers don't get the overtime. It would have increased driver pay, it would have improved highway safety, and it would have helped address supply chain delays. Let's think about the times when this legislation was put in. When the Fair Labor Standards Act was enacted, anybody know what year it was? 1938. 1938. Truck drivers were exempted from the law's requirement for overtime pay when they worked over 40 hours a week. This ain't 1938 anymore. The thinking was, in part, that this would discourage drivers from working as many hours as possible to get overtime pay. And I get it. We need safety, too. But if you fast forward 85 years into the future, it's today, a lot has changed in the trucking industry. Truckers, every movement is tracked. They are under enormous pressure to get their work done as quickly as they can. This exemption is problematic for truckers because they are often paid by the miles they drive, no matter how many hours they work. It ain't fair. It just isn't fair. This means that if a driver experiences delays due to traffic, congestion, weather, or waiting to be loaded, again, things beyond their control, or unloaded, they are not paid overtime, even though they're working. Truckers can easily work 50, 60, or 70 hours a week, but not be compensated for any of that time. Instead of preventing truckers from working too many hours, this exemption has devalued a trucker's time and led them to work even more hours. That's the bottom line. At the end of the day, they're working even more hours because of it. Truckers are an essential component of our nation's supply chain, and compensating them appropriately is the least we can do to support them, not just talking at committee hearings. Let's be fair. Let's be decent to the hard-working men and women who do this job. It is a hard job. I know truckers well. It's a hard job. I know I couldn't do it. Mr. Pugh, these questions are for you. I got one on time for one. Is there any reason that truckers shouldn't be paid overtime like most other blue-collar employees? And if this exemption were to be repealed, what do you think the impact would be?
I think, for one, truckers, if the impact would be truckers would have a greater love for Congress. And yes, I think it will improve safety, it will improve drivers' lives, it will improve retention. The same people that are pushing for speed limiters because they say trucks need to slow down are the same people that are against paying truckers overtime. Trucking for as long has been a piecework industry where you're paid by the mile. My opinion would be if you pay truckers by the mile and you have some crazy concern that truckers are going flying down the highway, which they're not, but if that's what you think, probably paying them by the hour and paying them overtime would automatically put them to where they should be going, if that's what you're trying to get at.
Absolutely. I yield back.
Gentleman yields. Mr. Garamendi, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for the witnesses, thank you for participating and giving us some good information. A couple of questions. Mr. Stangalore, does UPS have problems recruiting and retraining and retaining drivers?
I would say that the UPS has a substantially different recruiting and training environment than just about any other carrier, because folks know that coming to UPS means strong wages, meaningful career progression, employer-paid health care. And when you can offer those things to your employees, people want to come.
I think we ought to keep that in mind. That's part of the answer to the question that was just raised by my colleague about hours and pay. This is a question for Ms. Reineke. The Ocean Shipping Reform Act, which this committee and Congress passed last year with rather strong support from your organization as well as others, also revised the advisory committee for the FMC, the Federal Maritime Commission. However, organizations like yours are not on that advisory committee. We're carrying a bill to address that. Would you care to speak to that issue about who should be on the advisory committee for the FMC?
Congressman, thank you for the question. I assume you're mentioning CTPAT, the Customs and Trade Protection Advisory Committee. Yes, sir. So for whatever reason, when after CTPAT was created, the brokers were not included in it. And essentially, it's a TSA pre-check for freight. And so it seemed like the more eyeballs on freight coming in from international waters, it would be better to have people included who have a stake in it. So our argument has been that brokers have a visibility into the supply chain, have visibility into international partners, and should be included in that task force. There is legislation on the Senate side, not yet introduced on the House side. It's a bipartisan solution to have 10 of our broker members be part of a pilot project to be included for a year. It seems like that's a no-brainer. We're hopeful that there will be House introduction and it can pass without incident.
I'm quite certain every member of this committee heard your explanation for the support for the bill that I just introduced, and we'll get it into the package along the way. Thank you for your testimony on that. Finally, Mr. Faikavi, you spoke to the all types of fuels should be available at your facilities. There's one type of fuel that you raised, I'm just curious about it. You said that the effort to go to biofuels was making it difficult for other fuels. Could you speak to that in a little more detail about what you had in mind there?
Sure, Congressman. Thank you for that opportunity. I think you're alluding to the discussion around renewable jet fuel and renewable diesel fuel.
Exactly.
Right? Yeah, so those are two petroleum fuel substitutes that have far more favorable environmental attributes than the petroleum fuel that they are intended to displace. The question for Congress is, how should we allocate the finite amount of feedstock, this is generally vegetable oil, used cooking oil, animal fats, things like that, to make as much biofuel as possible so that we are displacing as much petroleum fuel as possible. And what we have seen is that renewable diesel fuel is far better for the environment than renewable jet fuel, and every incremental unit of feedstock that you put into a production process, you make 10% more renewable diesel than you do renewable jet fuel. There has been a concerted effort on the part of the aviation sector to try to achieve ESG and favorable climate outcomes, well-intentioned, but their approach has been basically to try to encourage Congress to force taxpayers to subsidize the migration of that feedstock and that production process away from renewable diesel and over-the-road fuels, which are more efficient and far more better for
Thank you.
I'm
We're
sorry,
about to
sir.
run out of time. Could you please give us detailed data on the argument that you just made? This issue is relevant in the NDAA. I and others are pushing the issue forward, and your argument is extremely important. Thank you so very much, but get us the detail right away.
I'm happy to do that. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, and good morning, T&I. Let's go to Missouri, where Mr. Burleson is recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Burleson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pugh, I wanted to kind of follow up on some of the comments that you made. You know, during COVID, truckers saved America. I mean, kept food getting into our grocery stores, and provided medication, supplies, transported everything that we needed. Can you elaborate on the impact that your drivers had and the difficulties that they faced during COVID?
Thank you for the kind words. And yeah, truckers help save America along with the first responders and others as well. And I'm proud and happy to do so. Anytime there's a national emergency anywhere in this country, truck drivers are always there hauling the supplies and the needed goods and getting the things there. COVID was very tough for truckers, I guess you would say, because unfortunately what happened was we have this emergency, truckers are asked to step up to the plate and get the goods there, which they did, but then restaurants closed, they couldn't get food. State rest areas closed, places like that where they could go off to use the restroom. Now they have nowhere to go to the bathroom. As far as getting the things that first, like the wipes, the masks, all these things they need, the personal protective gear, I guess you would say, they didn't have that. They couldn't get that. Fortunately, FMCSA finally did get that along with our help and ATAs to get that out to them. But there was all these things that we as American consumers and people were taking for granted that truck drivers didn't have. Then the big thing I think was that nobody talks about was what did truck drivers do when they got sick? You know, these people, these men and women on the road, they're 500, 1,000 miles from home. I have been sick like that. It's terrible. And that's just with the cold. Now, you want these people to quarantine, not be around people? Where are they supposed to go? We had members who called in that their carriers told them just to park the truck and get home however they had seen fit. These people were just left out there with nothing. So, yes.
Thank you, Mr. Other question. So after COVID, I remember speaking with our chambers of commerce, advocacy groups, and I had a question raised to me for the first time, and it was the first time that it became a top priority of the chamber, but they had no solution to it. But they said, can you do anything that you can to improve the supply chain issues that are impacting all of the businesses, whether it was hospitals, any business down the line, whatever your business was being impacted, and still today is impacted by supply chain. In your testimony, you talk about some of the things that actually that are being proposed. So, for example, the new EPA rule, the proposed rule, will that improve the supply chain?
No, it will not improve the supply chain due to, again, we're talking and having technology forced upon an industry that it either doesn't exist or it's not proven. And again, we all know things that are proven work, and consumers should not be guinea pigs or test rats for anything.
Yeah, so the other question is, there's this push to move to electric vehicles. Is that going to improve the supply chain?
Not at this point, no, because there's so many occupational things out there that nobody seems to have answers for. I look back to the snowstorm we had a couple months ago in Northern California. How do electric snowplow trucks work? Because there's lots of componentry on a plow truck, for example. Not only does it move the engine move the truck, but it also operates the bed, the thing that spreads the salt, the plow. There's all these things that work off of that.
The other rule that's being proposed is this side underride guards requiring that they be installed, which has an estimated annual cost of $1.2 billion. Is that going to improve the supply chain?
No, again, we're looking at so many operational challenges that no one wants to discuss as far as side underride guards, and also the unintended consequences. One big thing is becomes, if all these have trucks, have these on them, they get stuck on a railroad track, and we start seeing an increase of these center hungs on railroad tracks. There's only two ways to get a center hung truck off of a railroad track. That's a tow truck or a train.
Mr. Pugh, it would appear that all of the policies being implemented are actually devastating to the supply chain as opposed to improving it.
I think the ones that you brought up, you're correct. They are not helping the supply chain.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Williams is on deck, but first, let's go to Nevada, where Ms. Titus is recognized for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Drum roll, here I am. I'd like to go back to Mr. Boss's point. I'm a co-sponsor of his bill that would invest $755 million in a parking program for trucks. I know in Las Vegas, sometimes you just see them parking on residential streets. This isn't good probably for the trucker, or the people who live in that area. So could y'all, any of you or all of you, talk about how in putting that program in place for safe parking areas would help supply chain or help in the issues that we've been talking about today?
Sure, Congresswoman, I'll start. Thank you for the question. What our membership, which again provides over 90% of existing truck parking capacity in the country, what we support in particular about the Boss bill is that it is clearly designed to facilitate public-private partnerships so that we are getting parking places, not just a greater number of them, but we're getting them built where drivers want them. And what we find is that when drivers park, they don't necessarily want to park in an empty rest area or an empty way station. They want to park adjacent to or at a truck stop or another facility that has amenities that they want, right? We don't only have fuel, but we have showers, we have sit-down restaurants, we have facilities that function as the home away from home.
You have slot machines?
I'm sorry?
I said you have slot machines.
Well, in Las Vegas, we certainly do. So does the airport, though.
Okay, well, thank you. Anybody else want to weigh in how this helps maybe with safety or with the supply chain? Mr. Pugh?
Yeah, I would add, and that's the good thing about this bill. This is something we all need to work on. This is something the government, the truck stops, probably everybody is going to have to fix this problem. It's a huge problem. The only concerns I've heard really push back on this is the expense, because, well, nobody likes the government spending money. I point out the fact that we give FMCSA millions, if not billions of dollars to go out here and oversee trucks and write truckers tickets for not parking at safe places or not taking breaks when they're supposed to. So why would we not give them $755 million to have some safe places to park?
Okay, thank you. I agree. I think it's the one thing that we have consensus on this committee that we can all agree on, that need for parking. Mr. Spandaglia, could you talk a little bit about the misclassification of truckers as independent contractors? You brought that up, and I think a report that you cited said you found 49,000 of the estimated 75,000 port truck drivers were at one time or another misclassified. Can you tell us how that process works at MLRB and what we might be able to do to improve it, or what happens if somebody's misclassified?
Yeah, absolutely. And to hit on, I think, both of those questions there, for what that means for drivers and what that looks like, really starting with deregulation in 1980, we saw a degradation and a snowballing effect in the industry for what trucking jobs look like and how trucking companies are arranged. And we unfortunately now see this enormous explosion, as we've seen for decades now, of trucking companies who classify their employees as independent contractors in order to get out of providing them any of the protections that would otherwise apply. They exert a level of control over them that suggests an employer-employee relationship. And that employee is out of luck, and that's a really terrible environment for the driver.
So they lack any kind of benefits like health insurance, unemployment, that sort of thing?
You would be on your own. You would have to go look for health insurance on an exchange. As we discussed earlier, you wouldn't be eligible for overtime benefits. Critically, as an independent contractor, would not inherently have the right to join a union. But to your other question, because I think it's important on the NLRB, when these cases are brought before the board, one unfortunate thing we've experienced is an enormous delay in getting them processed. I'd say we have seen the board historically take well over 150 days, and there are cases that have gone for years. And that's unacceptable for the employees that are being impacted. So whether that may very well be a question of funding for the board, but we need to not continue to exist in a circumstance where folks are bringing cases and not having those cases adjudicated for an unacceptable period of time.
Thank you. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ms. Sykes, you're on deck, but first let's go to New York where Mr. Williams is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I love talking about supply chain, and it's fun to be here in this topic with experts and so much of our nation's transportation supply chain and infrastructure that you touch. So thank you for being here. I have a little bit of background. I studied operations in my business program at the Wharton School, and just have enjoyed that and appreciate it. Mr. Pugh, your comments on these driver issues, I just want to recap them because I think they're important. The waits to unload at different facilities, the driver comfort issues that you brought up, rest areas, the availability of parking places, and that drivers often are not paid overtime for these waits, these sort of enforced waits over which they have no control, right, until they can unload at their destination. It strikes me that there's a tremendous human cost. This is a human issue. This is a workplace issue. It's potentially a safety issue, as you talked about in your comments. And all of these are valid and come at a very high human cost. But as I think about this hearing, I'm thinking, what can Congress do to take action to address these issues? Can we hit two birds with one stone? Can we address these human costs for hundreds of thousands of drivers? And can we also perhaps help alleviate our supply chain? This may be a little bit of a technical question, but I think that hopefully we'll have some interesting answers. We all know how important buffers are in any process, right? Including in any supply chain, you have built-in buffers to avoid bottlenecks. And that also includes in our transportation supply chain. And it sounds to me like drivers are being used, perhaps as Mr. Pugh has pointed out, maybe even abused, that they are being required to be this buffer, if you think of it as an entire system. And it's not because it's best for our supply chain. It's not because it helps us move goods in the most efficient manner, but it's because it comes at no cost, right? You can have a driver sit there as long as you like, and it's a no-cost option to build in a buffer into our supply chain. But there is a human cost. You have pointed it out. And I wonder also, is there a real actual business cost? Are part of our supply chain issues, and I hope this is the discussion that we can have, is part of the supply chain bottlenecks and issues that we have on a national scale precisely because there's this inefficiency built in for which there's no financial cost. There's no overtime pay, there's no wait time limits, there's no additional services. If some of these costs for drivers' idle time, or I think of it as utilization, right? That they're a resource, an asset like anything else, that we could improve their utilization, speed up unload time, shorten wait times. Would that also help alleviate our nation's supply chain problem? And I directed at you, Mr. Pugh, but I recognize all of your expertise to comment on thinking of this as a model. Could that be helpful? And I've left a lot of time for that. Look at that.
Yes, I think you hit the nail right on the head. And yes, I think we have taken the drivers and their time for granted for way too long. And it is a very big inefficiency that's allowed to continue. I bring up back during COVID, we saw the long lines of trucks out in California waiting to get into the port. And we kept saying, we need more trucks out there, we need more trucks. No, we didn't need more trucks. We needed them to load the trucks that were there more quickly. That's the key. If drivers and trucks were getting in and out of shippers and receivers in a timely manner, we'd need less trucks, there'd be less congestion.
I just mentioned, we want to work with our industry partners. There are some advanced technologies that can help, including geofencing, along with trying to manage appointment times and working with the shipper and receiver to assure that they have the right timing for the carriers coming in.
Would the gentleman yield for a minute?
Certainly.
As someone in the trucking business on a day-to-day operation that I own, we have stuff called detention. So if you're not loaded or unloaded in a certain amount of time, you're on the clock. And so are our drivers. So I would say that the free marketplace works pretty well in that instance.
It's a good comment. My time is up, but hopefully that's a helpful conversation and perspective to look at the actual costs in the system.
Thank you. Next, I'd like to recognize Congresswoman Sykes from Ohio for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much. I was really looking forward to my game show introduction from the previous chair, but I'll settle for that one. Thank you. Wanted to talk a little bit about some of the safety considerations, and maybe not so much in a question, but just a statement. And Mr. Pugh, I know you mentioned what happened in Ohio, and I'm an Ohioan, so always good to see a fellow Ohioan in committee. But in 2013, when the state made the change to increase the speed limit to 70 miles per hour, the Highway Patrol notified and reported several years later an increase of crashes upwards to 25%, and 22% of those were fatal. And so while that may have been an efficient need for the industry, we've been talking about the human toll, and glad to hear us talking about humanity, but also we should be considering our law enforcement officers and their suggestions, which is increasing speeds make people less safe, and it's probably one of the reasons why an increase of speed limit was tabled in Ohio this year as they were navigating their transportation budget. But I do want to continue to talk about the human toll and the human condition in the trucking industry, and we've talked a lot about drivers and whether or not there is in fact a driver shortage or retention shortage, but I know that there are other people who are supportive of the industry, particularly mechanics, and those who navigate the maintenance system and part of this. And so whoever feels most qualified to answer this question, I will open it up to the full panel. But what are some of the challenges for supporting roles in the industry, particularly for maintenance mechanics, that are impacting the supply chain of the industry?
I'll take the first crack at that. Thank you for that opportunity, Congresswoman. As I said before, truck stops offer a variety of amenities, including truck repair shops. One of the challenges that we have found is that a lot of OEMs are reluctant, and trucks are getting exceedingly complicated to repair, right? They used to be an engine like a car, now it's basically a computer system. And the longer it takes to repair a truck, obviously, the longer that truck isn't on the road serving the supply chain. One of the challenges that we have found is that a lot of OEMs are reluctant to share a lot of information with independent repair shops to enable them to expeditiously learn how to fix something that may not take a long time if you knew what, I'm a little bit out of my element here, but if you knew how to fix that truck, which if you went to a dealer that's affiliated with the OEM, they would be able to fix it quite quickly. They're reluctant to share that information with others, and we think that if they were able to do that, if they were more willing to do that or compelled to do that, it would not only lower the price of repairing a truck, but it would increase the speed at which trucks would be repaired.
And I'll add on to that. I think as we see increasing levels, as was mentioned, of technology added onto trucks and more complexity, and the shopping of those products to larger and larger markets, it seems fairly evident to us at least that we're not going to be able to do all that work via OEM warranty work on those vehicles. There's going to have to be a class of mechanics who's trained to do that work. We are proud to represent a number of mechanics who wrench on trucks, who wrench on transit buses, all number of specialized commercial motor vehicles. But it is going to be critical that if we are going to continue to deploy more and more advanced technology on trucks, that we are making sure that mechanics like the members we represent understand how to do their job.
Thank you very much for both those answers. And Mr. Scandalia, I would like to stick with you for this next question because you mentioned autonomous vehicles, but you said you didn't have enough time to talk about it, so hopefully I'll give you the time here. And I bring it up. I also serve on Science, Space, and Technology, where we've been talking about unmanned aeronautic equipment and the role in supply chain delivery services and whether there are opportunities, but also what are the impacts to the human workforce here. So if you could, in the next 40, 35 seconds or so, talk a bit more about what we could be doing to be forward-thinking for a chance and making sure that we're not decimating your industry and workforce.
I think one of the big things here is that Congress and federal regulators need to lead on a safety framework for the deployment of autonomous vehicles that considers testing, that considers deployment, that considers prescriptive safety standards once these vehicles are on the road. I think the Wild West 50 state situation we have right now, I don't think works for safety and doesn't work for our members.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You're back.
Congresswoman's time has expired. Next, the chair would like to recognize Congressman Allred from Texas.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank our witnesses for being here today and for sharing your expertise on how to keep consumer goods moving in our nation's supply chain. I'm a co-chair of the Supply Chain Caucus, and I appreciate the opportunity to continue these conversations on these important issues and look forward to working with many of my colleagues on solutions. Last year, as y'all know, Congress provided a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure, and I was proud to work with many of my colleagues here to get that done and to make much of that funding available to all sectors of the transportation industry. But Mr. Pugh, something you said in your testimony really struck me. You noted that you found that a 15-minute increase in detention time increases the average expected crash rate by 6.2%. That seems clearly unacceptable, and it's clearly something that has to be addressed, not only from a supply chain efficiency perspective, but also from a safety perspective. So how can addressing detention time at shipping and receiving facilities improve safety outcomes and our overall supply chain efficiency?
Well, unfortunately, there's no really government entity that has oversight over shippers and receivers in this thing. So to me, the easiest way this can be done is by removing the overtime exemption to Fair Labor Standards Act. Rising tide raises all ships, and this is asked of us lots of times. You guys represent owner-operators, which is true, but we also represent employee drivers. And the way we see this is, and we've looked at this many ways, and it's different freight, different things. There's so many different things in trucking that makes it tougher. And, you know, the thing is, if carriers start having to pay drivers overtime, they're of course going to put more pressure on shippers or receivers to load these trucks and get them moving down the road. And you're correct, the longer you sit around somewhere waiting to get loaded, unloaded, just boredom, mental boredom and everything makes you tired. Yeah. So that would be the thing. If there's a way to kind of force shippers and receivers to load you, you know, when you're sitting there and the product's sitting on the dock and you sit there for 4 hours because nobody's really interested in putting it on your truck for whatever reason, that's not the driver's fault. And the driver shouldn't be there. It's one thing, things happen. There's all, you know, machines break, things aren't ready. But a lot of times it's there. It's just nobody wants to put it on the dock.
Yeah. I was going to ask you about, you know, beyond making sure drivers receive overtime pay for time spent waiting, there are other ways that Congress can help address the root causes of the detention time, but it sounds like you already answered that, so thank you for that. I also think it's really important that folks can access the opportunities that the trucking industry provides and that they're not kept from participating on the basis of their gender or any other considerations that the trucking industry may not have considered. And so, Mr. Scandalia, I'm glad to hear that the Teamsters are serving on DOT's Women of Trucking Advisory Board. I was glad to hear you highlight the importance of paid leave in response to Congresswoman Norton's question. I'd like to give you some time to expand on that and what you've heard from your members on how important access to paid leave would be for them, particularly in terms of expanding these opportunities to women.
Absolutely. I think when we look at back to kind of the retention issues and the ability of folks to work in the sector, providing the protections that allow them to do that job and to also maintain their work-life balance and their family balance is incredibly important. And when we put people in untenable situations, we put people in situations where they're not going to stay. I think this is one of a lot of issues that we've discussed today where some drivers exist in a universe where they're dealing with a lot of very serious problems, whether it's wages, whether it's a lack of paid leave, whether it's being misclassified, and then we kind of throw our hands up in the air and say, well, why did they leave the trucking industry? So providing things like paid leave, paid sick leave, things that, for example, I think should be provided to all drivers regardless of where they work, but certainly that we provide to drivers through our collective bargaining agreements is of tantamount importance.
Yeah, well, I agree. When I was in the NFL, we had a 100% injury rate. That meant that every single player was going to get injured. Everybody's going to need some time off at some point for some reason. You don't know what it'll be. It might be welcoming a child, might be a family member who's ill, might be something in your life, but it does make a big difference. And I think the companies that do it, the agreements that are reached, lead to more efficient workers and folks staying in the profession. So thank you for your testimony. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Next, the chair recognizes Congressman Van Orden from the great state of Wisconsin.
The great state of Wisconsin. Got that right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I grew up with truckers in my family, so I appreciate this industry tremendously. I also understand that it's a key portion of intermodal movement of goods and services in the country would stop. It would just stop without our truckers. So some of you have I read every word of all of your testimony, and some of you have conflicting views about like the labor market, for instance. So you're saying you got a tight labor market, but then we also want to have these programs to bring younger people into trucking. So let me just throw this out there. What's the average age of a trucker right now? Anybody? Mr. Pooh?
Did you ask the average age?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's probably in the high 50s.
Okay, and is that going up or down?
I'm imagining it's going up. It's definitely an aging workforce.
Yep. So what's the average pay-ish? I know you got union stuff going on. Mr. Scandaglia, you want a higher wage, and I saw this, your comments in here, some of which were actually inflammatory. What about the average pay? What's someone walking away with and they're driving full-time?
The average pay?
Yeah.
For the long haul sector, I think it's around 50, but I'm not 100% sure.
Okay.
50, 60,000, but.
Okay. And some of you are in favor of having 18-year-olds be able to drive across state lines. That's correct. And some of you are not. And why is that, sir?
I think we have several objections to the under 21 program. Some of them are predicated in safety and our beliefs of.
Okay, hold on. What is the accident rate of 18 to 21-year-olds driving within state right now?
I think when we look at drivers in totality, anyone with a driver's license, the incident rates are higher. I actually think that one of the problems when we've talked about under 21 CDL drivers, we've talked at length about.
So, Mr. Scandaglia, do you know the answer to that question or not? What's the percentage of accidents for 18 to 21-year-olds compared to 20 to 40-year-olds and 40 to mid-50-year-olds? Is there a discernible difference that we can quantify to prove your point that these drivers are less safe than older drivers?
Are you asking what the percent of total accidents per age group is?
Yes.
I don't have that data in front of me, but one thing
Would you do me a favor, please, before we start discounting a younger workforce because we are aging, and as I said, this intermodal transfer of goods is going to stop without these drivers, and we're not recruiting people at the appropriate age. Please get me that information, and then we can have a real honest discussion instead of throwing around talking points. So if we can get a younger person, 18 years old, send him to school or her to school, get a CDL, and they're walking out with zero college debt, earning $60,000 a year, that's a hell of a good deal. And That's what I'd like to make sure that we can do. It's Falco?
That's fine, Congressman.
How do you pronounce it?
Fialkov.
Fialkov.
Yes.
All right. What's the ethnicity of that?
Russian.
Oh, very well. Okay. Well,
It was a lot better until a few years ago, but yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You're talking in your testimony about trying to make sure that we have electric vehicle charging stations. And, you know, I have grandchildren. I have 8 grandchildren, my wife Sarah Jane and I, and we want them to have energy. We also understand that we have 4 children right now that need to have energy. And I'm concerned, looking at your testimony, that you may be trying to skip the generation like the rest of the Biden administration is doing in an impractical manner. So what is the average time that an electric power tractor can drive right now?
So I don't know the average amount of time that an electric truck can drive, but I would appreciate the opportunity to clarify the testimony, if
please
I
do.
may. And we work very closely with you know, what probably as well regarded a retailer in the country is obviously
I'm with you,
headquartered
man.
in your district.
Yep.
We don't care what kind of fuel people buy. We don't care if people buy gas or electricity, just like we don't care if people buy Coke or Pepsi. Our challenge in entering the electric vehicle charging market is that it remains unacceptably difficult to identify a viable business case for installing EV charging stations.
Yep.
Many companies are doing it anyway in anticipation of that market developing, including Quick Trip.
Yep.
But the fact of the matter is, our view is that these grant programs that are being developed should be pursued with a keener eye toward overcoming that particular challenge.
I'd like to speak to you later about this because it's incredibly important. And right before my time gives up, I want to make sure that you understand, and I appreciate your support of year-round E15. That is awesome. With that, I yield back.
The gentleman from the great state of Wisconsin yields. Now the chair recognizes the congressman from the other great state, New York, Molinaro.
He says that about everyone. The great state. I appreciate that, Mr. Chairman. I was going to ask a couple other questions. I want to actually jump, Mr. Scandaglia. Putting aside the data, which is important, and I join my colleague in it. In if we're going to make these sorts of decisions, workforce decisions, certainly they ought to be based on actual data, and we appreciate that you all are engaged in that conversation. But when it does come to safety, it is paramount to all of us, and we recognize not only automation, but just the fact that we have an aging workforce. Let me allow you then some more time to talk a little bit about what steps we ought to be taking to build up that workforce and to adapt the workforce to address what we expect and already are seeing, as was discussed and you've all talked about already, advances in technology and the developments within the industry.
Yeah, so I think to take that is kind of 2 questions on the retention piece and making sure that we have a younger workforce and that we don't have a workforce that's all about to depart as they retire. I think that just comes back to the question of making the industry an attractive place to work. And when people are looking at the trucking industry, and you know, certainly there are good actors, certainly we have, I think, very strong unionally bargained contracts. But when you look at, you get hired as an independent contractor with a predatory truck lease and no health care, insurance, or Social Security, that's a tough job. And I think a lot of people are going to look at that and say, that's not where I want to work. And again, to my earlier point, I think it's important that Congress interrogates some of those questions instead of us kind of throwing our hands up in the air and saying it's a mystery. To your second question on kind of automation and technology, we know that, and we're seeing increasing development and deployment of new technologies, of both driver assistive technologies as well as people who are looking at full automation. And I just think it's very important that we don't wait until these things are on the road and until we're past the point where we need our needs met. If these technologies are going to be deployed, let's make sure mechanics know how to wrench on them now, not 10 years from now when all of a sudden we have no mechanics who are qualified to work on this kind of equipment. I think that given the changes that these technologies present to the industry, it's incredibly important that both Congress and regulators are forward-thinking.
Would the gentleman yield for a minute?
I'll kneel for 30 seconds, Mr. Collins.
I'm not sure if the gentleman out there is aware of it or not, but we already have platooning going on in this country where you can line up trucks one behind the other within about 3 feet. It looks like NASCAR drafting, which the first truck is handling all of the rest of the trucks and the behind him as far as speed and brakes. So the industry's already working on technology. As a matter of fact, Anheuser-Busch is running an automated truck, driverless truck right now, 24 hours a day, and I think it's running between Texas and Louisiana. So it's already being conducted out there.
Well, I'll reclaim my time. I know that Mr. Collins knows the industry certainly better than I do. I'll let you continue that conversation offline because I want to jump a little bit more to safety as well. And Ms. Reinke, if I could, I'm co-sponsoring the Motor Carrier Safety Selection Standard Act, as you likely know and certainly understand. This bill would help fill the gaps in current law by requiring brokers to verify that their motor carrier is properly registered with the DOT. They've attained the minimum required insurance levels and are not determined as unfit. Can you just, I certainly understand the value of the bill and that next step. Would you just expand on that and its benefit, please?
Yes, Congressman, thank you for your support of the legislation. As I mentioned in my testimony, NHTSA reports that truck accidents have gone up year over year in the double digits over the last 3 years. We believe one of the reasons why is that 92% of the trucks out there are not rated. If we had a safety rating system that worked, you could get that compliance rate much, much lower. And in fact, you could actually have 100% compliance as opposed to 90% uncompliance. So the purpose of the legislation is to establish this interim standard in the meantime, and we think that's going to be a benefit.
Thank you, Ms. Reinke. And to Mr. Pugh, since my time is basically up, New York is always on the top of the wrong lists, and when it comes to truck parking, I think we rank number 5 as having the greatest shortages. How bad is it in New York?
As someone who trucked in New York a lot, especially around the city, it's very bad, very, very limited spaces to park.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Next, the chair recognizes Congressman Stanton from Arizona for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the witnesses for being here today. It's an important hearing. Moving freight into and through Arizona is an essential part of our economy and our nation's supply chains. In 2019, 285 million tons of freight were carried by trucks across our state. In Maricopa County, our largest county, more than 17,000 trucks pass through each day, traveling either from or to the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach and to the east, or from Mexico. 17,000 a day is a staggering number. In Arizona, more than 90% of truck drivers say they have trouble finding a place to park their big rig, and more than 60% say they spend, on average, more than half an hour trying to find a safe place to park. There are about 7,000 parking spaces throughout the state, but at prime locations such as Interstate 40 near the California border or near Phoenix, spaces start to fill by 9 p.m., and just a few hours later, parking is at full capacity. We don't have enough parking spaces now, and we certainly don't for the future. Truck freight is expected to increase by more than 50% in Arizona over the next 2 decades. This is a critical safety issue and an important economic issue for our state and country, and it's why I support Representative Boss' bill to provide dedicated federal resources to improve existing parking infrastructures and to increase capacity. It is not often that we see near unanimity on an issue in the trucking sector, but the need to provide more safe truck parking might be that critical issue. And I know throughout this hearing, there's been a lot of questions and discussion about parking. I wanted to make that point, but I'm going to ask a different question, and this question is directed at Mr. Pugh. Mr. Pugh, in 2018, the Department of Transportation's Inspector General issued a report about driver detention that delays truck drivers face when loading and unloading their vehicles. The report found that just a 15-minute increase in the time a truck spends at a freight facility increases the average expected crash rate by 6.2% and decreases the earnings of for-hire truckload drivers by over $1 billion annually. Can you speak to the impacts of detention time has on owner-operators and on the supply chains, and any suggestions you might have for Congress on helping on the issue of detention time.
As I've stated before, the Fair Labor Standard Act removal would be one good thing. We try to get our members, and along with, we've asked Ms. Rinke, and I know that her members try to get the importance to the shippers and the receivers of how important it is to get trucks in and out of these facilities. Probably something else that would help, which not really common, is flexibility, and a little bit of flexibility in our service. And I don't mean more time to drive by that. I mean when drivers can kind of make their schedule fit what they need for deliveries and pickups, because sometimes that creates a strain on the supply chain because everybody's showing up at the same time. And again, I want to preface, I don't mean more driving. Truckers don't want to drive more, no matter what people tell you. They don't. They just want to be paid for what they do drive.
That's great. I have a few more moments. That was the singular question I had, so I'll open up to any other witnesses if you want to talk about the issue of detention time and what Congress may do to improve that issue.
I'll just add, as I said earlier, generally speaking, detention time is covered in our contracts. But certainly, we support everything Mr. Pugh just said on making sure that there are no drivers who are denied detention time pay.
Thank you. Any other witnesses? Ms. Fialko?
Sure, I'm happy to chime in, primarily with some anecdotal information that relates to the truck parking issue, which is somewhat adjacent to this. But many years ago, before, and I'm not advocating for a change in policy per se, but many years ago, before there was an hours of service regime, before a lot of consumers expected goods to be delivered to their house a day after they ordered online or the same day they ordered online, truck parking lots were full in the morning, in the afternoon, and at night because different drivers were driving during different times of day. Today, right now, you can go to a lot of truck stops throughout the country that have a lot of empty parking spots. That's because drivers are compelled by shippers and by other requirements, hours of service and whatnot, to all kind of drive during the same time, not only as one another, but as motorists in general, which results in truck parking lots being empty during the day and full at night. So I think that the truck parking shortage is something that needs to be addressed, and I think that Congressman Bost and Representatives Craig's bill goes a lot toward doing that, but there are a lot of other factors that influence this that need to be examined too.
Thank you very much. My time is up, so I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields. Next, the chair recognizes my friend from Georgia, Mr. Collins, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I was sitting here listening, I guess I was running through different things on what y'all have been talking about. And as a small businessman and someone who's second generation in trucking industry, I started my own trucking company a little over 30 years ago. I look at things as what's the problem, what's the solution? And I know you were talking about trying to make repairs and not having software, and you were talking about trucking parking problems and driver retention and driver attracting. And I would say that one of the main things that we have a problem with is the liability out there. We need tort reform in this country. You can't park at shippers and consignees anymore because they don't want to hold the liability if something happens. So they've pushed them off their yard and make them go park somewhere else. A lot of your rest areas in these states, you can't park there because the Department of Transportation comes by and bugs you to death. So we have created a lot of our problems, but a lot of it is tort reform. And Mr. Pugh, no matter what's being said down here, that is the purest form of entrepreneurship and small business when you have an owner-operator out there. That's a person starting their own business. And if they don't want workers' comp or group insurance, that's up to them. But could you speak just for a few seconds on liability insurance and what insurance costs are doing?
Yes, that's a huge concern and been a huge concern of ours for a long, long time. As we know, we've seen in the past, trying to increase this cost on small business truckers and carriers. Our members, we see anywhere from $10,000 to $30,000 a year that they're paying in liability for one truck. It's one truck. Trucking is not a high-profit industry. It's a especially small business, it's a penny saved business, not a penny made business. And, you know, I've seen some guys with quotes as high as $50,000 and $60,000. Myself, I was leased to a carrier for many years. As you saw in my safety record, I was thinking about getting my own authority just before coming here to OIDA. And at the time when I priced it for a guy with 23 years experience, 2.5 million miles, my first year of liability insurance, I was quoted over $25,000.
Thank you. You know, and the problem is nuclear verdicts out there with these runaway juries. And if we've got to have tort reform. I would say that Obamacare also increased group insurance tremendously for small businesses out there. I know it has for us. Another problem I see out there is we've got a $1.2 trillion infrastructure bill that's out there with only $600 billion that went to fix roads and bridges. Do you see any congestion out there on the roads when you're driving?
Yes, all the time.
Would you say that the advancement of EVs and electric buses and vehicles are going to help that congestion, or just go out there and sit with the rest of us?
I don't see where it's going to help, but that's my opinion.
It's been a proven fact over and over, if we would just improve the congestion problems that we have on the interstate, that the current amount of trucks out there could handle the freight that's needed to be moved. But instead, we have an administration that puts their emphasis on some of these other social issues or some of these crazy issues that we can't even drive an EV truck because the things weigh 30,000 pounds. Mr. Pugh, what's the average weight of one of your trucks?
Probably around 30,000 pound empty. They can haul 50,000 pound loaded.
That includes the trailer.
Yes.
The truck itself, what, 17?
15 to 17,000 pounds probably.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So the other thing that I wanted to hit on, because I know my time is limited now, 18-year-olds driving. Mr. Scandaleg, I'm sorry. Back in the 80s that you referenced to when you said drivers started going away from this industry, what was the age of the minimum age you could have to drive a truck?
I'm not sure.
It was 18. I got my driver's license when I was, my class 5s when I was 18, 1985. Then we went to age 21, which in my opinion, if you were, I graduated from high school, you would have to stay at home or do whatever until you turned 21 to get your commercial driver's license. Today, trucks are so much safer than they were when I learned on a 2-stick Mac. You get in it and you drive, you push R, N, or D. They're all automated. They've all got collision avoidance. They'll all slow down if they come up on traffic. They all have rollover stability. We have ABS brakes now, which we didn't have in the 80s, which these trucks stop on average about 150 feet shorter at 60 miles an hour. So I do not understand why there is such a push to keep 18-year-olds from driving a truck. And I see that I'm out of town. I hate to rant. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back whatever I have left. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. Next, the chair recognizes the Congresswoman from Oregon, Ms. Hoyle, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, sir. I didn't go to Wharton, but I did spend 25 years working in manufacturing, distribution, and international and domestic trade. Also, I would be remiss not to mention that we're working to build a port in Coos Bay, Oregon, and it would be the 3rd major container port on the West Coast, going straight to rail, but we will need trucks. But it would help reduce the supply chain crisis, and if anyone wants to talk about it, check with me afterwards offline. I'll talk about it a lot. So, you know, as I said, I worked in distribution, both domestic and international, and I certainly support the free market. Absolutely. Had been a small business owner, worked in business. But there is a role for government, and that is an investment in infrastructure and roads and bridges and ensuring that there's adequate safe parking. Like, if we want to attract workers, the best way that I've found to do that, and I've hired a lot of people, work a lot on apprenticeships and workforce, is to increase the wages, hours, working conditions, and safety conditions, which we all agree we need more parking, especially if we want more women in the field. And as you mentioned, Mr. Pugh, that, you know, the age of drivers is just is getting older and older. Younger people are not coming into trucking. We need to do that. Now, I wish my friend from Wisconsin, Mr. Van Orden, was here. I did a cursory glance about the rates of accidents for younger drivers versus older drivers. So drivers from 16 to 19 have 3 times the number of accidents as drivers 20 and older. And when we have so many trucks on the road, and I talk to a lot of truckers in my work, and they are concerned about the lack of qualified drivers on the road, and that is scary. So there is a role, and you know, I know we need more drivers, we need to figure this out, but not if it's going to make our roads unsafe. And again, actions have consequences. I'll point to NAFTA, right? We allowed all these Mexican trucks to come over, and they don't have the same safety considerations, right? Those trucks don't have the same standards. So I strongly believe in that role for government, and I want to work with everyone here to make sure that we're moving young people into this job, and that as we do things, whether it's autonomous vehicles or it's you know, changing how we attract people to this business or train them, that we do it with an eye on safety. And I also will say, we don't invest in our infrastructure enough. We have to figure out how to pay for the roads, and it's really, really critical. But with the rest of my time, I would like to follow up and allow Mr. Scandaglia you were starting to talk about your concerns with autonomous vehicles, which again, I support moving that way, but only if we have clear safety considerations, because we have a lot of people on our roads.
Thanks for the question, Congresswoman. I think there are 2 things here that are primarily on our mind as the Teamsters. One is, from a federal perspective right now, we are really dropping the ball on oversight of the autonomous vehicle industry. In our opinion, I don't think that's debatable. States are doing whatever they may want to do, both good and bad, and it's left companies to pursue autonomous vehicles in whatever the way they want without the benefits of federal oversight. So I think the first piece is that we strongly support real federal oversight and real federal safety regulation on the deployment, testing, and performance of autonomous vehicles. And the second piece is, you know, I understand, to Mr. Collins' point earlier, that there are some extremely limited deployments of autonomous vehicles today in the market. That's very different from full-scale commercialization across the country. Those are not the same thing. Regardless, if that's the point that anyone expects that we will arrive at one day, it is incumbent on Congress and the federal government to think of and prepare for the effects that may have on a displaced workforce.
Thank you. I yield the remainder of my time.
The Congresswoman yields. Next is Congressman Nails from the great state of Texas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Today I'm going to use my time to discuss some priorities I've been working on in the 117th and now the 118th Congress, and I think they're common sense initiatives that will help the taxpayer. As both Chairman Graves and Ranking Member Larson often reiterate, this committee is a workhorse committee, and I'd like to point that both of my bills are bipartisan. I believe strongly that when taxpayer funds are spent, the primary beneficiaries should be American companies and American workers. And in the 117th Congress, I partnered with Congressman Garamendi and introduced the Domestic Preferences for Building America Act. We reintroduced the bill, and I believe it should pass. And specifically, the legislation would require that infrastructure projects valued at more than $100 million receiving federal financial assistance be built by domestic contractors and domestically controlled joint ventures. Our tax dollars should not go to foreign firms supported by non-market economies or countries watch-listed by the U.S. Trade Representative. The second piece of legislation I want to discuss is the Trucker Bathroom Access Act that I co-authored with Congresswoman Houlihan. And Mr. Pugh, could you tell us, what's it like for a trucker to try to find a place to simply use the bathroom when you're out on the road? What's that like?
Well, unfortunately, it can be a struggle, and I never thought we'd be sitting here in the House of the Congress of the greatest nation in the world talking about giving people the right to use the restroom when they're trying to do their job. But unfortunately, I guess that's where we've gotten in society thanks to COVID. This all came out of COVID as we saw so many places close their restroom and close their restroom access. Now, it happened at places before. It haven't happened to myself personally. But since COVID, so many places have never opened their facilities back up. Drivers, like we have talked about, they're allowed to work a certain amount of time, they have a certain amount of hours. So they are trying to get to where they need to be, get the products delivered to the shippers and the receivers. The least a receiver could do is allow that person to use their facility that they have in place already when they get there, and it's not happening.
It's just not that simple, is it? Yeah. The organization Women in Trucking, they're very supportive of my legislation to ensure restroom access for truckers. Do you believe being denied access to a restroom is preventing women from starting careers in trucking?
I think yes, for sure. I mean, we all know that the operational challenges to use a restroom for a woman is more than a man.
Right.
So, of course, why would women not,
Is it making it more difficult for women to remain in jobs behind the wheel?
Yeah, I would for certainly say.
I just want to put on the record and say to all the lobbyists and the trade associations trying to sink this bill, because they're out there trying to sink this bill, first of all, I really don't care what you think on this issue. I really don't care. Just imagine if Congress opted to ban lobbyists from using bathrooms as you wait outside these committee rooms or offices. Imagine if you were told, hey, all the lobbyists, all you guys, go outside, find a tree. Hell, go find the fire hydrant. Go outside and relieve yourself because we're not going to let you do it in here. How long do you think that would last? I bet you they would be very, very frustrated. I think it's, what do we want to treat our truckers like cats and dogs? You got to take the dog outside to the backyard, this and that. Let's do it with women and men that are in the trucking industry. Shame on those lobbyists and those trade associations for trying to sink this bill. I believe it's the right thing to do. I will continue to fight like hell, Mr. Pugh, to pass these two important pieces of legislation. And with that, sir, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Next, the chair would like to recognize Congressman Burchett from Tennessee for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Pugh, right, on the end down there. The Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration is working to restrict all heavy-duty commercial vehicles to a single top speed nationwide. Do these speed limiters threaten highway safety? And is that commonly what we call governors?
I beg your pardon, what'd you say at the last?
I said, do these speed limiters threaten highway safety?
Yes, they definitely would threaten highway safety, and there's many things we could do that would improve highway safety instead of this.
How are these going to affect our supply chain, which is already damaged?
It's going to slow down our supply chain. If you slow down trucks, it means it's going to take them longer to get somewhere. With them taking longer to get somewhere, it's going to create, we need more trucks. We all heard about, the retention problem and all these things. So we're going to need more trucks, which will create more congestion on the highway, which will just slow the supply chain down even more.
And isn't it true that most of these trucks are tested out and rated to go a great deal faster than these minimum speed limits that we're setting, and it also chokes the trucks down to where the diesel fuel is emitting out the exhaust. It's not fully ignited.
I'm not a scientist, but I would say from my mechanical knowledge of what I've learned, that is true. And most trucks today are designed or spec'd. When you buy a truck like myself, when you purchase a truck, you purchase it to run at a set speed. You get a gear ratio and all these things to where you can run that truck, probably in the zone or the region you're running.
In your opinion, what are the federal laws or regulations that need to change to move freight faster and more reliably?
I think flexibility in hours of service would be a big help. I think better parking, of course, would be a big help. I think driver training, which is something we haven't talked about much in here at all, training people to get into the industry in the first place, more teeth into that training to where people come into this industry, They know what they're doing, they feel safer, they're safer, better drivers, and they stay. Increasing paying overtime to truck drivers will also help with that. And another thing we talked about, this is a safety thing and will help the supply chain, more enforcement of the highways for speeders. And I'm not talking trucks, and I'm talking just more cops out there on the road watching what all the motoring public's doing. You can take a trip anywhere across this country, and you hardly see cops at all anymore. People are speeding and cutting trucks off. You know, we've seen these ride shares, this different thing. So more enforcement over highways in general.
All right, Mr. Falco, is that correct? Is that how you say your name?
Yes, Congressman.
All right, thank you. How can these federal electric vehicle charging grant programs better support and encourage the private sector investment? Or can they?
Yes, no, I appreciate the question. The challenge with electric vehicle charging, as we see it, is marrying two different industries. You have a regulated electric utility industry that by definition is kind of operating in a guaranteed rate of return environment. And then you have the refueling industry, which is an extraordinarily competitive industry, right? It's not uncommon to see multiple gas stations at the same corner selling the same fungible commodity for the same price, right? So getting those two industries to work together is something that we think is extraordinarily important if that new vehicle fueling technology is to take off. The challenge that we found with these EV charging grant programs is that they are being treated like they are any other infrastructure program, right? You get money to DOT, DOT gives the money to a state DOT, and then they spend the money in accordance with whatever parameters are established for them. We think that those parameters should prompt states, which tend to have more jurisdiction over the electric utility industry, to update the regulatory regime governing that sector so that it better comports with the EV charging market that is going to need to take off to kind of initiate private capital to just systemically flow to this industry, so that if new chargers that are faster are invented in 5 years, we have an incentive to buy it without having to rely on.
They're not there yet. I mean, let's be honest with these electric vehicles. You're going to take 6-8 hours to charge, and I keep saying what we need to be. It needs to be like propane tank industry. You just pull in and pull your battery out, get another battery that's fully charged and put it in, because you're going to be waiting on the side of the road for 8 hours. And my time is up. I could rant on that all day. But thank you all so much for being here. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back no time to you.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. Are there any further questions from any member of the subcommittee who have not been recognized? Seeing none, that concludes our hearing for today. I'd like to thank each of you for taking time to be here to answer our questions and educate us on the intricacies of our supply chain, and for your testimony. I ask unanimous consent that the record of today's hearing remain open until such time as our witnesses have provided answers to any questions that may be submitted to them in writing. Without objection, so ordered. I also ask unanimous consent that the record remain open for 15 days for any additional comments and information submitted by members or witnesses to be included in the record of today's hearing. Without objection, so ordered. The subcommittee stands adjourned.